Early Sunday morning on August 7, 1966, near the small town of Everman, Texas, just a few miles south of Fort Worth, a farmer spotted a car abandoned on the side of the road. The trunk had been left ajar. When he opened it, he saw the dead bodies of two young boys. This tragic discovery marked the beginning of a series of crimes and trials that would span nearly 3 decades and ultimately transform Texas law. On Monday, October 26, 1993, one of the most famous trials in the history of Texas would bring a defiant killer face to face with a team of small-town prosecutors. It would be the biggest case of their lives.
If all that was standing between this violent and dangerous man in society was my group of prosecutors and investigators, we had a big responsibility to make sure we got it done right.
Almost 3 decades earlier, in 1966, the Everman, Texas Sheriff's Department responded to the scene of a terrible crime. A local farmer had discovered the bodies of 2 young boys in the trunk of an abandoned car. The local sheriff was baffled by the execution-style murders. In this episode, some of the names have been changed to protect the identity of the victims and their families. The farmer who discovered the bodies said he knew the youngsters. Both boys, Richard Bond and his cousin Matthew Duncan, grew up in Everman. Authorities learned that the last time their parents saw them was Saturday night, heading off to meet Richard's girlfriend, 17-year-old Laura Smith. Investigators feared she was kidnapped or worse. News of the shooting traveled quickly. That same morning, 100 miles away in the small town of Rosebud, a distraught young man surrendered to the local sheriff. His name was Roy Dale Green, and he said he had to make a confession. Green told Rosebud Sheriff Brady Pamplin that all 3 youngsters had been kidnapped and tortured by a local bully named Kenneth McDuff. It was not the first time Sheriff Pamplin had heard McDuff's name. He had previously locked him up for burglary, robbery, and assault at the age of 17. Today, 25 years later, Sheriff Brady Pamplin's son, Larry Pamplin, is the retired sheriff of Falls County. A young deputy at the time, he remembers the day Roy Dale Green walked into his father's office.
My dad had been in law enforcement all of his life, and he said that Kenneth McDuff was probably the most vicious, violent individual that he had ever come into contact with.
Green told the sheriff he and McDuff were cruising the small town of Everman when they saw 2 boys and a girl standing by a car near a baseball field. McDuff told Green that he wanted to find a girl he could rape and kill. And he told Green if he told anyone, he'd kill him too. Green said when they approached the baseball field, McDuff got out of the car with a gun in his hand and walked up to the 3 teens. Green waited by the car. He said he didn't believe McDuff really planned to kill anyone. He thought he was just fooling around, trying to scare them a bit.
Hey, get out of the car. Get out of the car.
But it was clear to the frightened teens that McDuff wasn't kidding. He held them at gunpoint and took their wallets.
All right. Come on back here.
As Green watched, he ordered the 3 youngsters to get into the trunk of their car.
Come on, man. Get in there. Get in there. Hurry up. You're next. Come on. Come on. Here we go. Here we go. Man.
When McDuff told Green he'd have to
Put him
kill
in
the
the trunk.
teens because they had gotten a good look at his face, Green said he still thought McDuff was joking.
We're having fun now.
Yeah, we're gonna kill him.
Take the car, drive. Follow me.
All right. All right, where are we going?
And he just went along with the game.
All right.
McDuff drove the car with the 3 teens in the trunk, and Roydale Green followed in McDuff's car. They didn't stop until they reached a secluded area on the far side of town. Finally, on a dark back road, McDuff pulled over.
Let's stay put. Just a girl. Come on out.
He opened the trunk, told the 2 boys to lay still, and ordered Laura out of the car.
Come on. Hey, come on over here, boy.
Green said McDuff told him to put Laura in the trunk of McDuff's car.
Do it now. That's right.
What are you doing, man?
Both boys were shot repeatedly in the face.
My father just could not visualize any individual, you know, especially a person 21 years old being so hardcore and so violent and having no sign of a conscience that they would repeatedly shoot the 2 little boys in the head.
Green said McDuff told him to erase their tire tracks, while he wiped the car clean of fingerprints.
And then McDuff got into his own car along with Roydale Green, the little girl being in the trunk, drove on down the gravel road, actually into Johnson County. And at that point in time, stopped the vehicle and raped the little girl. And Green raped the little girl. McDuff raped her again, and then choked her to death on the gravel road with Green holding her ankles.
And then, according to Green, they threw the body over a fence and covered it with brush. Sheriff Pamplin launched a massive search to find the body of Laura Smith. Roydale Green tried to help, but the area was unfamiliar to him, and he couldn't remember where they'd left the body. At the same time, a manhunt was launched to find Kenneth McDuff. Investigators had information that McDuff would be out on a date that night with a girl from Bremen, Texas. They waited at the girl's house, hoping he would arrive.
You know, it's been a number of years, but if I remember correctly, it was like 11:30 p.m. exactly when all hell broke loose.
When McDuff saw the lawman, he tried to back out, but the sheriffs opened fire, shooting out his tires and radiator, crippling the car.
It's over there. Oh, man. Covering.
McDuff was taken unhurt.
Man, you put holes, right?
It took days of searching before the body of Laura Smith was found and her family could bury her. Kenneth McDuff and Roydale Green went to trial in October of 1966. The first case to be tried was for the murder of Matthew Duncan. The prosecutors were confident they could get a capital conviction.
A lot of mean things.
They had a body, evidence linking McDuff to the victim, and an eyewitness. Former prosecutor Charlie Butts recalls that Roy Dale Green's cooperation alone would not be enough to convict McDuff of the murder.
Then we had the problem in Texas of corroborating an accomplice. An accomplice witness, and certainly he was, needs to be corroborated with some evidence that tends to show that he's telling the truth, or tends to connect the person he is saying is guilty.
Key pieces of evidence enabled the prosecutors to corroborate Green's testimony. 2 wallets belonging to the victims were found in a field, and Kenneth McDuff's burned and bloody shirt were found buried on property belonging to his older brother. In return for his testimony, the prosecutors would not pursue the death penalty for Roy Dale Green's role in the murders. But McDuff would get no plea bargain, and he didn't want one. He denied any part of the crime, and his biggest supporter was his mother, Addie McDuff. She had a long history of denying any of her son's troubles. And when she supported her son Kenneth in blaming Green for the murders, the prosecutors exploited what they considered to be the weakest element of McDuff's defense.
Then he made a mistake of laying it all off on Green. Said that he had taken a nap or something and claimed that Green had gone off and done all these things. And you could look at Green and tell that kid couldn't even conceive of doing that, let alone carry it out by himself.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
But McDuff claimed he was innocent. The police were out to frame him. Now the jury would have to make the decision: to convict Kenneth McDuff for murder or to set him free. In November 1966, in Fort Worth, Texas, 21-year-old Kenneth Allen McDuff was convicted for the murder of 15-year-old Matthew Duncan. The jury sentenced him to death in the electric chair for the execution-style slaying. McDuff showed little emotion. After the trial for the murder of Matthew Duncan, the prosecutors saw no cause to try McDuff for the murders of the other 2 teenagers. Kenneth McDuff had been sentenced to die in the electric chair. Texas author Gary Laverne covered McDuff's murderous career for his book, Bad Boy from Rosebud.
There was some security there because he had been convicted of one and had been sentenced to death. And at least there was a notion in Texas at the time that surely nothing could be more final than a death penalty.
Huntsville Prison, Texas. McDuff was on death row, waiting. His first execution date was stayed. Then his second. By April 1970, McDuff was still in his 20s. He was awaiting his 3rd scheduled execution date, but he was confident that this date too would be canceled. Then in 1972, the Supreme Court made its landmark decision in the case of Furman versus Georgia. The court ruled that the death penalty as it was currently practiced was unconstitutional.
Break time.
Minorities and those with low incomes were not receiving equal treatment in the courts. As a result of the ruling, McDuff's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. And under Texas law at that time, that meant, eventually, this triple murderer would have the right to apply for parole. 8 years later, in 1980, McDuff came up for parole. At the time, 3 parole board members would hear an inmate's case, and it would take 2 votes to pass. McDuff's good behavior in prison convinced one of the members, but the other 2 voted it down. By the late 80s, Texas prisons were getting dangerously overcrowded. while little money was being spent to build new ones. The parole review system was taking the heat.
The people of Texas did not want to vote new taxes to expand government. And expanding a prison system is an expansion of state government. So political leaders at the time responded by instructing the Board of Pardons and Parole to literally release thousands of people every month. And as time went on, more and more violent criminals were being paroled under a perfectly legal process.
By the time McDuff was up for parole once again in 1989, his application was just one file stacked on top of a mountain of others. After 15 denials for parole, Kenneth McDuff, incredibly, got his letter of release. It didn't take long for word to reach the sheriff's office in his hometown. Sheriff Brady Pamplin, who had arrested McDuff in 1966 for the shooting of the 3 teenagers, had retired. And his son Larry was now the new sheriff of Falls County.
When I first found out that Kenneth Allen McDuff had been released from prison, the first thing I did was call Parnell McNamara in Waco, Texas, Deputy U.S. Marshal. Parnell and his brother Mike, both are marshals, and we've been friends ever since we were little bitty boys. And I called Parnell and told him, I said, Parnell, you're not going to believe this, but they've released Kenneth McDuff. And I don't know if it'll be 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, but sooner or later, the bodies of young girls, young ladies, or boys are going to start turning up.
Now, a second generation of Texas lawmen feared they would be dealing with Kenneth McDuff. Parnell McNamara and his brother Mike are the sons of a lawman who helped put away McDuff in the 1960s. Today, they are investigators with the U.S. Marshal Service.
And I remember just sitting there in total disbelief. I absolutely could not believe that anyone in their right mind would have ever paroled a serial killer, someone who had brutally murdered 3 young people like he had. Total disbelief.
On October 11th, 1989, Kenneth McDuff was escorted out of Ramsey Prison. Although he had been sentenced to die 23 years earlier, he was now a free man. McDuff returned to the town of Rosebud, Texas, where he grew up. People in his hometown were terrified when they learned he had been released. The town began to shut down. Doors were locked, shades drawn. Attendance at the schools dropped.
There were reports of families not letting their children out, of bus drivers being told to be careful because McDuff is out. And that's the sad irony of all of this. When he was in school, he caused school officials trouble, even as a young kid. Now, he's been in prison for 23 years, he's let out, and bus drivers have to be careful all over again. It was a very bizarre event in the history of Central Texas.
The citizens of Rosebud were much relieved when Kenneth McDuff moved away from home. In the spring of 1991, McDuff enrolled in the Texas State Technical College at Waco and moved into a dormitory on campus. He received financial aid as part of his rehabilitation program, and for the next year, he regularly reported to his parole officer. But authorities would soon learn that McDuff was far from rehabilitated. On March 1st, 1992, Waco police responded to a call that a clerk from a convenience store had disappeared. 22-year-old Melissa Northrup was working alone on the overnight shift at a Quick Pack.
From the time he got here.
Her husband told police that he had just been on the phone with her when a customer walked in.
Red Oldsmobile.
He called back a few minutes later, but got no answer. Police found Melissa's purse under the counter, and her car was missing from the parking lot. Waco police did a routine check of cars at a nearby motel. They found a car that the manager confirmed did not belong to a guest. Investigators found a wallet in the car. It contained a Social Security card and a driver's license, both belonging to Kenneth McDuff. Investigators looked for McDuff at his college, but no one had seen him for several weeks. Students said he was a heavy drug user, and prostitutes visited his dorm room. Waco police could not locate McDuff, but investigators were soon called back to the college. A student had found a naked, decomposed body in a shallow grave in a wooded area behind McDuff's dormitory. But this would not be the body of Melissa Northrup. It was yet another victim. With McDuff on the loose, local investigators had to act fast. They feared that after 23 years, Kenneth McDuff was once again on a killing spree. On March 25, 1992, a woman's body was found buried in a shallow grave behind the Texas State Technical College at Waco. This victim would turn out to be Valencia K. Joshua. According to a student witness, she was last seen on campus looking for Kenneth McDuff. Weeks earlier, Kenneth McDuff's car was found abandoned near the Quick-Pack store where another missing woman, Melissa Northrup, was last seen. But in both cases, the investigation had produced only the most circumstantial evidence. And with McDuff on the run, local investigators sought the help of U.S. Attorney Bill Johnston.
Our concern was, now, but who's he killing now? Who's he going to kill tonight? And we really felt strongly that he was on a spree.
Johnston knew that if he could charge McDuff with a federal violation, he could coordinate a statewide effort to apprehend McDuff. And he could bring in the full investigative talents of U.S. Marshals Parnell and Mike McNamara.
I wanted to find a way for Mike and Parnell McNamara to get involved in this thing. I'd seen them on many manhunts. I knew how good they were. And I just wanted some hook to drag them in with.
It was McDuff's well-known drug use that opened the door. The federal investigators found a young man who said McDuff had given him LSD. This was enough to write a federal drug warrant, and a task force was formed. U.S. Marshal Mike McNamara.
And we contacted every agency that we possibly could. And in a very short period of time, every law enforcement agency in the Central Texas area was involved in this manhunt.
The McNamara brothers began interviewing anyone who ever associated with McDuff. And when they tracked down a man named Alva Hank Worley to a Temple motel, they knew they were onto something. Worley said he didn't know anything about the Melissa Northrup abduction or the Valencia K. Joshua killing.
Worley did not respond like a normal person would to our interviews. When we explained to him what McDuff had done in 1966, Worley seemed oblivious to it. It didn't seem to either register with him or bother him in the least. So when we left the motel where Worley was living, everyone in the car agreed that something was wrong with Worley, that he wasn't acting right.
Over a period of weeks, the McNamaras returned to the motel to talk to Worley, trying to break him down. Eventually, Worley agreed to come into the Bell County Sheriff's Department and give a complete statement. He claimed he knew nothing about Northrup or Joshua, but Worley said he had information about a missing persons case currently under investigation by Austin police.
Hank Worley told us that on the night of December 29th, 1991, that he and McDuff were in Austin and they passed by a car wash.
McDuff pulled into one of the car wash bays and told Worley to stay with the car.
Go over here and change.
According to Worley, McDuff went to the next bay where a young woman was washing her car. Worley said McDuff returned to his vehicle, holding her by the throat. He said McDuff raped and killed her, but he claimed he didn't participate in the murder. In the abandoned car, Austin police found a purse and identification belonging to the victim, Colleen Reed. A surveillance photo at a nearby ATM machine helped narrow the time of her disappearance to sometime after 9:15 p.m. Worley claimed he could not remember where McDuff had disposed of her body. Now investigators finally had an eyewitness, the same kind of weak, suggestible accomplice that helped put McDuff away 30 years earlier in the murder of the 3 teenagers. But they still had to find McDuff. Over 12 state and federal agencies participated in the hunt for him. And when there seemed to be no trace of McDuff in Texas, the search went nationwide. All the major networks and news organizations ran stories on the fugitive. A hotline was set up. And on May 3rd, they received a tip.
And the call was that a fellow that drives a trash truck, a garbage truck in Kansas City, thinks McDuff might be up there with him. Of course, we thought, you got to be kidding. I mean, Kansas City, you might as well have said the moon to us, because we were convinced he would probably stay in areas he was familiar with.
The tipster said another driver going by the name of Richard Fowler looked like McDuff. Luckily, this Mr. Fowler had been arrested for soliciting in Kansas City, and Kansas City police had a sole index fingerprint on file. That one fingerprint belonged to Kenneth McDuff. At 1:30 in the afternoon on Monday, May 4th, McDuff, now on the run as Richard Fowler, was driving his garbage truck to the Kansas City dump.
How you doing? Step out of the truck for me.
Police, posing as truck inspectors, waved him down for what he thought was a routine check. McDuff came out of his truck with his log and was too surprised to run when they cuffed him. Kenneth McDuff was flown back to Texas under heavy guard. The burden was now on the prosecutors to make sure McDuff never again walked the streets of Central Texas. The body of Melissa Northrup, the Quick-Pack store clerk, had recently been found in an abandoned quarry in Dallas County. Her car stuck in the woods nearby. The body of Colleen Reed, the woman abducted from the car wash, was still missing. Prosecutors had an eyewitness, but without a body, murder would be difficult to prove. For the homicide of Valencia Joshua, there was no eyewitness and no physical evidence pointing to McDuff. Of the 3 cases, elected prosecutor of McLennan County, John Segrist, decided to first try McDuff for the murder of Melissa Northrup.
Our strategy was to tie him as many times as we could to the victim, to the scene of the crime, to the scene, to where the body was found, to the motive for murder, anything we could possibly find to make those ties and reinforce the ties as many times as you possibly could. And hopefully we could build a case that was strong enough and the circumstances were such that this jury could say that beyond a reasonable doubt, this was the man responsible.
First Assistant Crawford Long, a forensic expert, would present what little physical evidence they had and concentrate on trying to prove McDuff's pattern of behavior to the jury.
When you're presenting a case of circumstantial evidence, the problem is the jury likes to hear a person come in and say, I saw that person do the crime. I saw the defendant kill the person. In a circumstantial case, you're not going to have that. You're going to have small bits and pieces of evidence, when taken all together, will point out the defendant as the killer.
First Assistant Freeman would bring McDuff's associates to the stand to provide testimony about his movements on the day of the murder and the violent nature of his behavior.
Generally, a person's character is not admissible to prove their conduct. However, the law in Texas provides it can be used to prove motive and to prove identity. We had a case that was built like a domino house.
A domino house built around a man who knew how to cover his tracks. Even his friends said he understood a single hair could send him to prison. He took great care wiping off fingerprints. But ultimately, no crime scene can be left perfectly clean. And there were some foreign hairs found in Melissa Northrup's abandoned car. Though DNA tests were ordered on the hair, a portion of the test became contaminated by the lab contracted to perform the analysis, and the prosecutors couldn't present any of the DNA evidence in court. The small-town prosecutors would have to prove to the Houston jury it was McDuff and only McDuff who killed Melissa Northrup. But without an eyewitness and no conclusive forensic evidence, McDuff's attorneys could make a convincing argument that their client was innocent. The prosecution had no direct evidence linking Kenneth McDuff to the murder of Melissa Northrup. Kenneth McDuff's trial for the murder of Melissa Northrup began in Houston in February of 1993.
All rise. Court of the Honorable Judge Hagedorn is now in session.
Thank you.
The prosecutor made his opening statement to the 12-member jury.
We're going to show you
He began with a detailed account of the events leading up to Melissa Northrup's kidnapping and murder. He described how McDuff's car broke down near Highway 35 and New Road in Waco, that McDuff had spent the day trying to raise money to smoke crack, and, as McDuff had said to a friend, get a woman. Just before 4 in the morning, the prosecutor told the jury, McDuff left the car in the parking lot of the New Road Inn. At this point, there are no eyewitnesses, but the prosecution sets the scenario that McDuff walked to the nearby Quick Pack convenience store. A prosecution would show that McDuff had worked briefly at a different Quick Pack store and he knew how it operated. He knew it had no security cameras. He knew the night clerk was alone. He knew there was cash in the register.
Sure, come on around.
And he left no evidence, not a single fingerprint. The prosecutor told the jury that Melissa Northrup's car was found near Dallas a few days after she had disappeared. A short while later, her body was found floating in a gravel pit by a couple of fishermen. Her hands and feet had been tied with shoestrings. There were no fingerprints, no confessions, nothing personal left at the crime scene except a few hairs.
Who will
The prosecution's strategy was twofold. To build their circumstantial case, they needed to track Kenneth McDuff's every move on the day and night Northrop disappeared. Secondly, they needed to prove a pattern of violence.
Nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Hoping to establish McDuff's violent, unpredictable behavior, the prosecution questioned his associates on the stand.
My name is Stephen Dowdy.
The problem was, these witnesses had criminal records of drug use, prostitution, and other crimes, and the prosecutors had to convince the jury their testimony was truthful.
Speak up just a little, please.
And before the prosecution's key witness could take the stand, the prosecutors would have to convince the judge to allow his testimony. The judge asked the jury to step out of the courtroom before he would hear the state's argument for calling Alva Hank Worley. Worley was a witness to the abduction and murder of Colleen Reed. The prosecutors needed Worley's testimony to show a pattern between the Reed and the Northrop case. The pattern of the hunt, the capture, the torture, and the hiding of the two bodies.
We were able to show the judge what we believe was 22 characteristics that were consistent with the Melissa Northrop case. The judge agreed that there were at least 15 consistencies between those two cases. For example, both were young, white, Caucasian females. Both were short and weighed approximately 100 pounds. Both had their purses left behind. Both took place along Interstate 35 corridor.
Although the Colleen Reed case had not yet come to trial, the judge ruled that Hank Worley, the eyewitness to Reed's alleged abduction from the car wash and her murder, could tell the court what he had seen.
I so swear.
According to Texas law, a witness could provide testimony to show the modus operandi of the accused. Now, the prosecutors could show the jury how McDuff kidnapped and murdered his victims.
What in particular did Mr. McDuff say?
He said he was going to take himself a girl that night.
McDuff's friends were generally slow-witted people that McDuff felt he needed to have around him to reinforce his superiority complex. What he didn't figure on was that these people would have a conscience and would break down.
Please tell us what else happened.
Worley said McDuff liked to talk about snatching women, and he saw him do it to Colleen Reed at the Austin car wash.
He got out of the car and he walked around the wall and he grabbed the girl by the throat and then he brought her back over to the car.
What did he intend to do with her?
Well, he said that he was going to get rid of her. Use her up or get rid of her.
Worley said McDuff tied her feet and hands with shoelaces, just like the shoelaces found on the body of Melissa Northrop.
Yes, sir.
Having failed to prevent Worley's damaging testimony from being heard by the jury, the defense now had only one recourse: to discredit the witness.
Makes you involved more and
McDuff's
more
attorney
as far
vehemently
as that
attacked
sexual
Worley as a
assault.
liar and a
Isn't that
rapist.
true? In fact, you stated at one time, I tried to untie her. I told her I would try to help her. She wanted me to stay back there with her because she knew I would not hurt her.
That's right.
And you helped her by raping her. Isn't that correct?
I did not rape her.
Are you telling the jury that she voluntarily had sex with you?
She knew that I wasn't going to hurt her. So long as I was back there with her, I wasn't going to hurt her.
The defense's attack on Worley was a blow to the prosecution, and there was still another weakness in the case. There was no eyewitness placing McDuff at the gravel pits in Combine, Texas, where Melissa Northrop's body was found. But then, a surprise witness came forward.
I got a note from my investigator that there was they received a phone call from a young lady in Dallas County who lived very near the gravel pits where Melissa Northrop's body was found, and she wanted to talk to us.
Sherry Robinson testified that on March 2nd, 36 hours after Melissa Northrop was abducted from the Quick Pack store, a dirty and disheveled McDuff came to her door late at night asking for food.
I heard a light tap at the door, and I opened the door and I stood there. And he said he was hungry, and him and his old lady had just gotten into an argument. And you know, he asked me if I had a sandwich. I don't have a sandwich. I have a bowl of beans.
That'd be fine. That'd be fine.
Okay. Well, I got the bowl of beans and I gave it to him, and he went on his way.
Robinson had placed McDuff within 2 miles of the location where Northrop's body was found. Stunned by Robinson's testimony, McDuff demanded to tell his side of the story. Though his defense lawyers argued against it, McDuff was confident he could convince the jury of his innocence. His attorney was so upset, he asked the judge to be taken off the case, but the judge denied his request.
We had hope that McDuff would take the witness stand. Even the judge took him back into chambers and told him, "You're making a bad move."
McDuff took the stand. He believed he only needed the chance to tell his side of the story, and once he did, the jury would see that he was an innocent man.
The whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Against the advice of his lawyers and the judge, Kenneth McDuff took the stand and professed his innocence.
Mr. McDuff, did you on March 1st, 1992, abduct and murder Miss Melissa Ann Northrop?
No, I had nothing to do with that. On Saturday, I went out and I bought some beer, and I was already...
McDuff began to recount a long and winding journey on the day of the murder.
Saturday night,
he barely let his lawyer get a word in edgewise.
I was already starting to drink.
Before we get into that...
Why don't you let me finish this, okay?
No, I want to ask you another question.
It was Saturday night, I bought the beer, and
McDuff claimed his car trouble at the New Road Inn was just a coincidence. He said he spent the early morning pushing his car with another car up to the motel. He testified that at about 5 a.m., he went back to the dorm of the Texas State Technical College and went to sleep. He said he took off the next day, afraid of trouble from his parole officer because he was doing drugs. Now the prosecutor had his chance to question McDuff. He asked him if he had abducted Northrop from the Quick Pack.
Would you state your name?
Used her car to drive her to a remote area about 100 miles north of Waco, and eventually abandoned the car near a quarry where her body was found.
Well, if it would have been me, I wouldn't have drove that car that far. If I was going to commit, I mean, it just don't make sense to me.
So, what you're telling the jury, it's your tough luck that you happen to be at the very place where Melissa Northrop was kidnapped, at the time she was kidnapped.
Look, I think the facts show that I was there after that event. I had to push that car for 45 minutes, okay? If I had walked from where my car broke down to the Quick Pack and then walked back again, I mean, we're talking about a whole lot of time here.
The prosecutor had no more questions. For the first time, McDuff admitted having been at the Quick Pack store. He seemed to have become entangled in his own incredible story and inadvertently blurted out the truth. The defense attorney told the jury that the case had little to do with law or evidence. It depended on fear, hatred, and a willingness to despise the defendant. In the state's closing, the prosecutors argued the pattern was clear. That the evidence shows the defendant was every person's nightmare. The evidence shows that he's a monster that comes out of the dark and snatches innocent people. The jury was out for just over 3 hours.
Defendant, rise.
McDuff fit the definition that most people would have of a true sociopath, in that he showed no emotion whatsoever, except anger.
Kenneth McDuff, this court finds you guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Melissa Northrup. This court is adjourned.
He showed no emotion whatsoever. One of the prosecutors of the 1966 trial described his eyes as dead eyes, that they were black and like a shark.
For the kidnapping and murder of Melissa Northrup, McDuff would get the death sentence. Confident they could win again, the prosecutors indicted McDuff for the murder of Colleen Reed, and once again the verdict was guilty and the sentence death. Certainly, the citizens of Texas were in an outrage that their parole board ever released McDuff in the first place while serving a life sentence for the 1966 murder. It inspired Texas voters to fund a $2 billion building program for new prisons. The governor at the time, Ann Richards, was able to spearhead a number of reforms that became known as the McDuff laws, including a new definition of life in prison as 45 years behind bars before coming up for parole. Assistant U.S. Attorney Bill Johnston moved on to other cases, but kept his eye on some unfinished business in the McDuff case. The body of Colleen Reed and 2 other victims had not been found.
His time for execution was like a month or 2 away when we felt like, let's make a push here.
McDuff had admitted to a regular visitor that he had killed 2 other women in addition to Colleen Reed and Melissa Northrup. He told the visitor where he had buried their bodies, but for some reason McDuff refused to talk about Colleen Reed.
He didn't want to. And what he said was, they won't need me anymore. Well, I mean, this is a guy that's going to be executed in 3 weeks. I wasn't sure quite what he thought anybody needed him for.
Then prison officials promised McDuff whatever he said, he would be treated no differently, no better, but no worse. And McDuff revealed a remote location by the Brazos River.
I don't want to lose my privileges.
Where even after following McDuff's directions, investigators were having no luck. In a last-minute decision, prison officials brought McDuff, chained and shackled, to the Brazos River site.
I didn't like him being so personally involved. I didn't want him to have that satisfaction, but it turned out that it had to be. There was just no way to do it without him.
Once he arrived at the site, McDuff told investigators where to look for the grave of Colleen Reed.
Whoa! Stop! Stop!
Finally, Colleen's remains were revealed. Kenneth McDuff's appeals finally ran out on November 17, 1998. On that day, he was administered a lethal injection.
His last words were, "Release me." And that summarizes the murderous life of Kenneth Allen McDuff. To the very end, he considered himself the victim. He considered himself the object of oppression.
Kenneth Allen McDuff murdered and disposed of his victims with deadly precision and chilling premeditation. When investigators found the shallow grave of Valencia K. Joshua, they also found a second grave nearby. But this one was empty. Fortunately, McDuff was arrested before he had the chance to find his next victim. May 15, 1990. In rural Delaware, investigators exhume a partially decomposed body from a shallow grave. Detectives launch a nationwide investigation, and a sadistic serial killer becomes the target of a streetwise New Jersey prosecutor who must build his case on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a convicted felon. In 1990, William J. Purdy, Assistant District Attorney, coordinated an investigation and prosecution in an effort to end the deadly rampage of a brutal killer and the people who protected him.
They thought they had everything figured out, and they had pretty much effectively gotten away with murder on 2 other occasions. Police were on their heels, but never could get enough to just push it over the edge.
On July 9, 1990, Newcastle County, Delaware police received an urgent 911 call. A body had been discovered in a shallow grave on the side of a dead-end road. Detective Alan Ruth headed the investigation.
What do you got?
Heavy rains during a recent thunderstorm had exposed a skull and shoulder to the elements. A forensic team removed the earth surrounding the bones and revealed a complete body. The corpse appeared to have been folded over and buried in a fetal position.
Who found him?
While walking their dog, a local resident and his wife had found the body.
Gary, you can take the house on the right and canvass that.
Detective Ruth instructed the officers to secure the
Do you have
area.
any other units that can come out and block the road off down the end? Sure, let's go. Somebody want to give recon a holler?
Police would close the road while the forensic team removed the body from the earth. Working like archaeologists, the investigators carefully dug a trench around the remains.
We actually dug down, started off really far away with shovels, and then we actually got to where we felt we were lower than the body would be, just by the angle of the upper shoulder area and the head. And then we worked our way into the body with like little small spades.
The medical examiner had decided to remove the surrounding earth along with the body so as not to disturb any evidence. The remains were then transported to the morgue for autopsy. The medical examiner determined that the remains were those of a young woman in her early 20s who at one time had given birth. The advanced state of decay prevented the medical examiner from determining the exact cause of death. He did, however, classify the case as a homicide. Detective Ruth met with investigators and briefed them on details of the case.
As you can see by the picture John has, the ground's real wet. For those of you who weren't down at the crime scene, I mean, he didn't go to any great effort to bury her deep.
He hoped that the area surrounding the grave might yield some clues to the woman's identity and that of her killer.
See if we can track down any of the guys that are responsible for mowing grass that are up there all the time to give us an idea when they were there last.
Investigators checked police reports of missing persons in neighboring states.
How far back do you want to go? 3 months.
But they found nothing.
Guessing.
Detective Ruth ran a search on the NCIC, the National Database for Violent Crime and Missing Persons. He got a match. In Clifton, New Jersey, Detective Nicholas Donato had been investigating a missing person. A woman had called the station to report that her cousin, Myra Napolitano, had disappeared. She felt that Myra, a devoted mother of two, would not leave and abandon her children. Donato had questioned the missing woman's neighbors and family, and now, nearly a month into the case, Donato got his first break.
Regarding Myra Napolitano.
It was a phone call from Detective Ruth in Delaware. Ruth informed Donato of the body they had recovered from the shallow grave. It matched the description of Myra Napolitano, which Donato had entered into the NCIC database.
All right, good. Thanks, William.
To confirm that it was Myra, Donato located her dental records, and investigators met with a forensic odontologist. He was able to positively identify the remains as belonging to Myra Napolitano. Myra had disappeared from her Clifton, New Jersey home on June 21st. Working with Donato on the case was Detective Lieutenant John Burke.
I think that we were comfortable at that point of officially saying it's not a missing persons anymore. You know, it is now a homicide. And then the next question was jurisdiction.
With the body found in Delaware and the missing persons investigation originating in New Jersey, the prosecutors from both states determined that the Passaic County Prosecutor's Office would take the investigation with the assistance of the Delaware State Police.
Yeah. All right, let's go out there, do a good job, and most of all, let's be safe. Dismissed.
2 days after Myra Napolitano was reported missing, her husband had come into the Clifton police station. Eric Napolitano was accompanied by one of his two sons and his mother, Carolyn. Eric shrugged off the report of his wife's disappearance, saying she had walked out on him. He even seemed offended by the officer's concern. Donato was not convinced by Napolitano's explanation for his wife's disappearance, and he was troubled by Eric's defensive reaction to the police investigation. He decided to question Eric's neighbors. Teresa Maltese said she had last seen Eric leaving the building the night before his wife disappeared, and he had, in her words, murder in his eyes.
I started to hear different stories of threats and certain behavior that was combative and explosive and threatening throughout the last couple of months. Marital problems had increased because Eric had a girlfriend, and Myra was finally coming to the decision that she was going to leave him. There were threats made that if Myra ever left, Eric would kill her.
Detectives wanted to re-interview Eric Napolitano. They found him at his apartment and asked him exactly when he had last seen his wife alive. He replied it was June 20th, around 8 p.m. at their apartment. The family had planned to have dinner at his mother's apartment in Manhattan, but Myra refused to go. And when he and the children got home around 11 p.m., Myra was gone.
Nobody picked up the phone.
Detectives were still skeptical about Eric's story.
He was given different stories whenever we talked to him. He said that Myra's family's hiding her out in the Bronx. We checked it out, that wasn't true. Then he said that, oh, she has a boyfriend. We checked that out, we couldn't verify that. Then he said that they're hiding her out in Puerto Rico. We checked it out, that wasn't true.
Within a week after Myra's disappearance, Eric and the children had moved out of the apartment. When Detective Donato conducted a routine background check, he discovered that Eric Napolitano had been a suspect in a homicide. On April 29, 1985, Eric's mother-in-law from his first marriage, Gladys Matos, was found dead on a street corner in the Bronx. She had been shot in the face 6 times.
Coroner's office, 327 Metcalf Avenue.
A few days before the shooting, Gladys had filed charges against Eric for beating and torturing her daughter, Wanda Matos. The murder weapon was never recovered, and no eyewitness was ever located. Digging still deeper into Napolitano's past, Donato learned that an old girlfriend of Eric's had also been murdered. On June 2, 1984, the body of Marilyn Colludro was found at a national park in eastern Pennsylvania. She had been wrapped in a comforter and bound with a thick cord. Her throat, face, and head had been violently slashed. The coroner's autopsy found that she was pregnant and may have been tortured. The body remained unidentified for more than 2 years, until someone in the New York City Police Department noticed that a missing persons report for a Marilyn Colludro had never been entered into the national database for missing persons. When the mistake was corrected, the body was immediately identified as Colludro's. The only suspect in her murder was Eric Napolitano, a man who investigators now feared was a serial killer. Detectives found links between the 1984 murder of Marilyn Colludro, whose tortured body was found in a Pennsylvania park, and the murder of Gladys Matos, who was gunned down on a Bronx street corner in 1985. The suspect in both cases was Eric Napolitano. Eric had been Colludro's boyfriend and Matos's son-in-law.
Just tell me where you were that night.
Police interrogated Eric about both murders.
You don't have nothing that's just fish.
At the time of the Matos shooting, Eric claimed to have been asleep at his mother's apartment. When questioned separately, Carolyn Napolitano backed up her son's story. She even filed harassment charges against one of the investigating officers. Because his mother provided alibis in both cases, Eric could not be charged with the killings. Investigators learned that Carolyn had a job in the New York City Police Department. According to investigators, she had access to, among other things, the missing persons database. William J. Purdy was an assistant district attorney of Passaic County, New Jersey at the time of the investigation.
The very frustrating thing about this job is to investigate a case, possibly know who did it, but not have enough evidence to move ahead and go to court with it. And that's where that was the status of those two investigations.
Eric Napolitano was the only suspect with the murder of his wife, Myra. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Eric's now empty Clifton, New Jersey apartment. Around the side, near a row of trash cans, they found a large cardboard box. At one time, it apparently had contained a bumper for a Toyota Corolla, the same model of car that Eric drove. Assistant Prosecutor Walter R. Dewey could not help but notice it was the right size to carry a body.
I think all of us got the sense that this was, in a sense, Myra's coffin, and that Myra had been transported down to Delaware for burial in Eric's trunk inside this box.
Investigators wanted to search Eric's car for evidence. Using an undercover police car disguised as a yellow cab, they placed Eric under surveillance. After following him through the Lincoln Tunnel, they closed in and seized the car in New Jersey. Eric was furious. He accused the police of harassment and demanded to know what he was being charged with.
Put your hands on the trunk. In front of my kids.
The investigators replied that he was not under arrest. They only had a warrant to impound and search his car. The vehicle, a one-year-old Toyota, was towed to a garage at the Clifton Police Department. Forensic investigators examined the car. They sprayed it with luminol, a substance that fluoresces in the presence of blood. But none was found. Special vacuums were used to collect fibers from the trunk and passenger compartment. The cardboard box that investigators had found outside Eric's apartment was sent to the FBI's Hair and Fiber Unit in Washington, D.C. Clifton investigators hoped the FBI lab would find some microscopic evidence that could help convince a jury of Eric's guilt.
You're going to give me the names.
To investigators, it became increasingly clear that Eric had covered his tracks well. And after 3 months, the investigation was losing momentum.
Yeah, we definitely need that when
But a subpoena for Eric's telephone records provided an important new lead. Investigators were particularly interested in one phone call made from Eric's apartment on the night of Myra's disappearance. The phone call was made at 2:44 a.m. Eric had told investigators that he and the children had gone over to his mother's house for dinner that night. He said that when he returned home at 11 p.m., Myra was gone.
The 2:44 a.m. phone call was interesting because it was a call from the Clifton apartment where the Napolitanos lived to the apartment of Al Giovanni in Queens, New York.
Al Giovanni was a close friend of the Napolitano family. They called him Uncle Al. Detective Donato and Lieutenant Burke visited Giovanni's apartment. They wanted to know why Eric had called him at 2:44 and whether Myra had been part of the conversation. But Giovanni flatly denied ever getting the call.
No, I don't. No, not at all. About that.
According to the phone records, he was lying. The detectives questioned Giovanni several more times, but he repeatedly denied getting the call. Investigator Pete Tallarico of the district attorney's office found that Giovanni would change his stories from one day to the next.
Every interview would be different with Al. Sometimes he would remember things. The next time you would question him about them, he didn't remember ever saying anything like that. And he was an interesting person to deal with.
Finally, the prosecutor offered Giovanni immunity in exchange for information about Eric Napolitano and the murder of his wife. But Giovanni refused the offer and divulged nothing. The investigators were getting nowhere. They suspected Eric had killed Myra, but were having trouble assembling enough evidence for an arrest and a conviction. In October 1990, 4 months after her murder, Myra's parents were awarded visitation rights with their 2 grandchildren. But when Myra's parents went to visit their grandchildren, Eric and the 2 boys were gone. Now investigators feared that Eric had skipped town, and they had no way to find him. They enlisted the help of the FBI. Agents began tracking purchases made on a credit card they had learned Eric borrowed from Al Giovanni. They discovered that it had been used to rent a moving van. When the vehicle was returned to a rental office in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the FBI knew where to begin looking. Nearly 7 months after the murder of Myra Napolitano, Eric was living with his children in Albuquerque. Agents were surprised to learn he was married again for the 3rd time. His bride, Sandra, was unaware that the man she had married was under investigation for murder. When the FBI discovered that Eric had taken out a life insurance policy on his new wife, they worried whether they could stop him before he killed again. Agents from the FBI had located three-time murder suspect Eric Napolitano in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In the midst of an intensive investigation, Eric had fled 1,800 miles from his home in New Jersey. He was now married again, but three women who had crossed Eric in the past were now dead. In an effort to predict Eric's next move and obtain a court order for a wiretap, investigators called upon Special Agent Greg McCrary at the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. They asked McCrary to assemble a profile of Eric.
The profile that emerged came from both background information on Eric Napolitano himself as well as the crimes, and together we were able to piece this together. And it was clear to me looking at this that we had an unusual type of offender, a sexually sadistic serial killer who in fact was victimizing people he knew, which many times is unusual. More commonly they're strangers. He had a pattern of abusive behavior with these women, whether they were his girlfriends or wives or whomever. Many times it's the need to dominate, humiliate, subjugate, and ultimately possess their victims, and the ultimate way to possess is to possess their lives.
The FBI profile classified Eric Napolitano as a sexual sadistic serial killer. The report convinced a judge to issue a court order to tap the work phone of his best friend, Al Giovanni. District Attorney William J. Purdy.
Well, they were able to correctly predict that Eric Napolitano, because of his relationship with Al Giovanni and his mother, would almost certainly turn to them. We had initially received phone records that did indicate they were in almost daily contact, several times a day.
Eric would call Al Giovanni's toll-free number, and Al would patch him through to Carolyn. The three would be on the phone together, planning what they would say to investigators.
Remember I told you that
The wiretaps were interesting, not that they had any admissions on them. None of these people ever came out and said, I did it. But they constantly spoke in a manner that was inconsistent with anyone who was innocent.
You know, they must still be investigating, but what I honestly think is the case has got to be shelved.
We also learned that he had obtained a semi-automatic weapon that he was carrying openly, which is legal out in New Mexico. But on the telephone, we learned that he was carrying that, and he was planning to possibly shoot Myra's father should he come looking for him to get the grandchildren.
Early on the morning of March 27th, an FBI SWAT team staked out Eric's apartment in Albuquerque. Concerned for the safety of Eric's wife, his children, and Myra's father, the FBI prepared to apprehend their suspect. The SWAT team's first step was to secure the apartment. When Eric left the building, they made their move. Eric's wife opened the door, and the SWAT team rushed in. They swiftly moved her and the children to safety in a back bedroom.
Now en route to your position.
This Carl's.
Then they waited for Eric to return.
He's going back in.
As soon as he returned home, he was ordered to, get on the floor. His gun was taken from him.
I want to know why you're here.
An agent told Eric that he was not under arrest. They only had a warrant to search his apartment. It was a ploy designed to get Eric to make one last self-incriminating phone call.
We were hoping that he was going to go to a public telephone. So he did that, and just as predicted, he called Al Giovanni, told him what was happening in his apartment, Started talking about evidence, started talking about what they would find, what they wouldn't find. So it worked very well. Later that day, he was arrested and returned to New Jersey. At the Federal Marshal's office in New Jersey, he was turned over to Detective Donato of the Clifton Police Department, who read him his Miranda rights, and after reading his Miranda rights and asking him, "Eric, do you wish to make a statement at this time?" Eric said to Detective Donato, "What do you think?" And that was all we got out of him.
Eric was charged with the murder of his wife, Myra. Carolyn was charged with obstructing the efforts of law enforcement officials.
What is down there now?
But then the strength of the case was called into question. Although the evidence was purely circumstantial, William J. Purdy, the assistant district attorney in New Jersey, believed he had enough to build a case.
Okay, very good.
I was more comfortable with it. I knew it was a tough case, but I went to my boss and talked to him, and my boss decided to go ahead and do it.
Then the prosecution received some good news. After months of lab work, the FBI Hair and Fiber Unit issued their forensic report. Fibers had been recovered from a pair of shorts on Myra's body. FBI technicians compared these to fibers found in the cardboard box outside Eric's apartment and fibers from the trunk of his car.
Common thread.
When arranged side by side in a comparison microscope, all three samples matched perfectly. But even this important forensic evidence was circumstantial, and by itself did not prove that Eric had killed Myra.
Then I can make out. It looks fairly common.
The 9-month investigation had not produced a single shred of direct evidence that Eric had killed his wife.
In Delaware came through Conrad and Webb.
The case of the state of New Jersey versus Eric Napolitano was tried in the Passaic County Courthouse in Clifton.
How are you today?
Presiding over the trial was Superior Court Judge Vincent E. Hull.
Bring in the defendant.
Eric was charged with the murder of his wife, Myra Napolitano. The prosecutors would not be allowed to submit evidence from the 2 previous murders Eric was thought to have committed. They would therefore be unable to establish a modus operandi linking Eric to all 3 murders.
Mr. Purdy, you may make your opening statement.
Opening statements began on April 22nd, 1993. Purdy went on the attack.
And see what he's really like.
He warned the jury that as they dig under the surface of the defendant's seemingly normal life, they will see what he called dirty little facts.
We have testimony.
No one would be saying they saw Eric kill his wife, but the circumstantial evidence would be convincing.
Circumstantial evidence can be more compelling and more powerful, and a jury can be more certain of circumstantial evidence than direct evidence. Eyewitnesses can lie. Eyewitnesses can misperceive certain things. A defendant can lie if you admitted his statement. Circumstantial evidence doesn't lie. It's often compared to a puzzle, but you start putting it together, and pretty soon what emerges is, even without all the pieces yet, this person is guilty.
We have evidence.
Ernest Capicella, opening for the defense, conceded that his client may indeed be obnoxious and spiteful.
Lies and deception, and the prosecution
Napolitano may be a bad person, Capicella said, but the prosecution had no cold, hard evidence that Eric had killed his wife.
Jury box and expect him to tell the truth. My client, Eric, may have had a few flaws, but he's not on trial for his personal characteristics. He's on trial for murder.
The prosecution called its first witness.
I'd like to call Teresa Maltese to the stand.
Teresa Maltese was Eric's downstairs neighbor.
Do you swear to tell
She would
the whole
testify
truth
to Eric's
and nothing
demeanor
but the
at the
truth?
time of
So help
Myra's
you God?
disappearance.
I do.
You may be seated.
To refresh her memory, Purdy pointed to a large calendar. but Maltese said she couldn't see too well.
I can't see that. I'm sorry.
Not the
sir.
sort of
I
thing a
forgot my
prosecutor
glasses.
wants to hear from a witness.
Myra and Eric's place.
Yes. Well, I let him in, and I went up to their apartment.
Maltese testified that she last saw Myra the night before she disappeared.
Really call out to her because there was so much noise.
A young man
going
from a
on.
moving company had come to make an
Running
estimate.
Back and forth into the hall. I'll show you.
Maltese knew that Myra was planning to leave Eric and move back to Puerto Rico. She testified that Myra looked upset. When Maltese asked her if everything was all right, Myra slammed the door in her face. But as Maltese continued, her memories seemed to fail her. She waffled on her story and appeared confused.
About the mother?
At first, she said Eric's mother had red hair, then later described her as having black hair.
Black hair.
The prosecutor asked Maltese if she saw Eric later that day.
You're sure that's how you remember?
It was around 7:30 that evening, Maltese said, when he came out of the apartment.
Didn't look very happy. That's all that I can say.
Now, in a previous interview,
During
you
her
said something
pre-trial
different.
interviews,
You're sure
Maltese
that's how
had
you
told
remember?
investigators that Eric had, in her words, murder in his eyes. And now she changed her story to something much milder.
A moving van at...
When Purdy asked Maltese to read her prior statements, she said she couldn't read.
Judge, I'm done with this witness.
Purdy was surprised and embarrassed. The prosecutors appeared ridiculously ill-prepared.
Ms. Maltese, you're excused.
Walter and I left the courtroom that day saying, what did we do? What did we get ourselves into? This case is nothing.
At the end of their first day, Purdy told Dewey, "This case is over. We've lost." Eric Napolitano was charged with the murder of his wife. As the trial entered its second day, the prosecutors feared they would be unable to regain the jury's confidence. Their first witness had waffled in her testimony, creating an impression that the state had no case.
Mr. Purdy, you may call your next witness.
I'd like to call Jeanette Canucaloo to the stand, please.
The prosecutors could only hope that the testimony of Jeanette Canuclu, Eric and Myra's neighbor, would be more consistent.
So help you God.
I did.
Baby seated.
Canuclu testified that she was present during a Monopoly game at Eric and Myra's apartment around Christmas, 1989. The more Myra won, the more Eric became upset.
And I'm just going to
He
take everything.
lunged at her across the table,
You think you're taking children from me?
and they started arguing.
You aren't taking anything from me. You ever try to take the children from me, I'll kill you. Do you understand me?
Calm down.
I'll kill you, Myra.
Calm down. Sit down, Eric.
Now, this threat that if she left with the kids, that he would kill her, did you hear that on just this occasion, or was it more than one occasion?
No, more than one, several times.
Now,
The prosecutor questioned Canuclu about another incident 4 days after Myra disappeared.
He had asked me to come help with the laundry.
Thanks for coming and helping.
She testified that Eric asked her if she wanted some of Myra's clothing.
I don't think so.
Canuclu, confused by the offer, asked Eric what he meant. Myra might come back, she told him.
I don't think she's ever coming back.
That's all the questions I have.
After a disastrous first day, the prosecution's case was back on track.
Raise your right hand.
The state's next witness was Detective Nicholas Donato.
Nothing but the truth, so help you God. May be seated.
For Donato, this was the climax of an exhaustive investigation.
Lieutenant, I'd like to ask you, how many times did you do...
Donato testified that in interviews with Napolitano, Eric said that the night Myra disappeared, he last saw her at about 8 p.m. as he was leaving to have dinner at his mother's apartment.
Good idea that the phone call did come through because it
When he returned home later that night, Eric said Myra was gone.
taking place from Eric's house to Mr. Jimmy's.
In an effort to show that Eric had lied to Donato, the prosecutor next called Gregory Velez.
Sir, please stand up, take off your hat in court.
Velez had been living with Al Giovanni at the time of Myra's disappearance.
How long were you with Eric's lawyer?
Phone records showed that a call had been made from Eric Napolitano's apartment to Uncle Al's apartment at 2:44 that morning. Velez testified that he answered the phone. It was Eric. Velez said that he got Al out of bed and went back to playing a video game. Al was hard of hearing and had a speakerphone that he turned up loud. This made it possible for Velez to hear the conversation. Eric was yelling at his wife. He told Al that Myra had a boyfriend. Velez said he could hear Myra in the background, vehemently denying Eric's accusation. When Giovanni asked Myra if Eric was hitting her, Myra said no.
All I know is there was an argument.
Velez said he overheard both Myra and Eric speaking to Giovanni on the phone. It was almost 7 hours after Eric had told Donato he had last seen Myra.
No further questions?
The prosecution had shown that Eric had lied to the investigators. The prosecutors next attempted to physically link the defendant with the crime.
Swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
They called an FBI forensics expert to the stand.
Your Honor, I'd like to enter these five.
The fibers that you found on the victim's
The agent related how he examined the cardboard box recovered outside Eric's Clifton apartment. In the box, he said, he found fibers that matched fibers found on the victim's shorts and in the trunk of Eric's car.
Eric Napolitano's vehicle to you.
The assistant district attorney entered the hair and fiber evidence into the court record.
Fibers, Mr. Fram?
Yes, I do.
The FBI technician testified that, in his opinion, the fibers were all from the same item.
A blanket, a throw rug, they're relatively fine fibers.
Continue, Mr. Purdy.
I'd like to play this tape for the court.
The prosecution then played excerpts culled from 2 weeks of wiretaps. On the recordings, Eric seemed particularly concerned that Al may have had his phone bugged.
I don't think a judge would give those assholes a court order to bug your work phone. I really don't think they would, because what are you gonna, you know what I mean, from bugging your phone, even though you talked to me, you're talking 8-9 months ago. What, am I going to be talking about it on the phone? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I doubt that, there's one thing you want to say.
They were constantly speaking about anything going on with that investigation, and in tones like this, very, very suspect tones. The jury then is able to hear this and say, these are not innocent people talking.
The prosecution had built a compelling case based on circumstantial evidence. Now they would have to take their greatest risk as they called their most controversial witness.
I'd like to ask about Greg Feliz.
Your next witness, Mr. Purdy.
The jury had heard witnesses implicating Eric Napolitano in the murder of his wife. But the evidence was only circumstantial. The prosecutors felt they needed more proof. Someone who knew Eric intimately. Someone to whom he had confided his secrets. The state called Al Giovanni to the witness stand. Giovanni would be the final piece in the prosecution's puzzle. They hoped his testimony would convince the jury that Eric was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They knew the defense could attack Giovanni's credibility by exposing his relationship with Gregory Velez, known to police as a prostitute and drug user. In an effort to minimize the damage, the prosecutor decided to reveal this information himself.
Did you pay him for sex the first time you met him?
First time, yes.
Now, did you receive a phone
Purdy moved
call?
on to the key question of whether Giovanni remembered receiving a phone call at 2:44 a.m. on June 21st, 1990, something he had repeatedly denied.
Yes, I did.
And who was that phone call from?
From Eric and Myra.
And what was going on during this phone call? What information was given to you by Eric or Myra?
Eric told me about her intentions to go back to Puerto Rico, and he was against that. He wanted her to get that Section 8 housing, you know? And there was a lot of hollering and screaming going on.
Giovanni then told the court about a call he received the following day on the evening of June 22nd. It was Carolyn calling to tell him that Eric was coming over. When Giovanni heard Eric beep his horn, he came down.
Look, Al, I gotta tell you something. Are you wearing a wire?
No, I'm not.
I killed Myra. She was gonna take the kids to Puerto Rico. I took her to Delaware.
You're sick.
I did what I had to do.
You're sick.
Giovanni said he was disgusted by Eric's confession,
Now, what was going on during
but he was afraid to go to the police. He said he knew what Eric was capable of doing.
Now, when Eric called you, did he say
Giovanni testified that the following day, Eric asked him to come over to his mother's house to pick up some clothes for the kids and himself. Giovanni said that Eric seemed worried about going back to Clifton.
He said, what do we do if the police are there? He said, I've cleaned the car up, so they're not going to find any evidence.
did he clean of the car?
Giovanni's testimony that Eric had admitted killing Myra and that he had attempted to obstruct the investigation was a stunning blow to the defense. To get Giovanni's testimony, the state had to drop all charges against him, except for hindering the investigation.
That's all the questions I have.
There was an agreement that was made for him to testify, and he got away with only a few years in jail. This is something that's the necessary evil of law enforcement. We make deals with people sometime, but we felt we were making deals with the person who didn't do the killing, but did know something about it.
The defense team struck back swiftly, raising questions about the reliability of his testimony.
You're going to have 5 years cut off your prison sentence, correct?
I imagine so, yes.
The defense hammered at
Now, in the
Giovanni's
past,
credibility.
Isn't it
They
true
wanted to
that
show
you
the
have
jury that
lied
Uncle
before?
Al was capable of lying under oath to save himself from more prison time.
5 long years, that's a long time, isn't it?
Well, just to me.
Of course it is.
The prosecution knew the risks of presenting a witness whose testimony came as the result of a deal, but it was a gamble they felt they had to make.
Honest with us?
Because it was a circumstantial case, I felt that a jury, even if they're satisfied that it's a circumstantial case, they could go out of there more satisfied if they get just one witness who said, yes, the defendant said he did it. He told me he did it. So that's why I put Al on, because he was going to give us that information.
The prosecution rested its case. When Judge Hull prompted the defense to begin presenting their witnesses, Capicella filed a motion to acquit based on insufficient evidence. Judge Hull denied the motion. The defense called Assistant U.S. Attorney Glenn J. Morimarco to the stand.
A few questions. These wiretaps
Morimarco
that
testified that the motion to reduce Giovanni's sentence for conspiracy was contingent on Al's cooperation with the prosecution. This bolstered the impression that Giovanni's testimony had been bought.
Permission to go ahead and wiretap.
The defense called only 3 witnesses.
Well, the permission was gotten from
Eric declined to testify in his own defense.
The reason was we suspected.
It had taken just 2 weeks for both sides to present their cases. On Thursday, May 6th, closing summations began in the murder trial of Eric Napolitano.
He did not like him at all.
The defendant's attorney stated his belief that many of the witnesses had an agenda. In other words, they didn't like Eric, and they didn't want the jury to like him either.
But you don't.
Capicella admitted that his client may have been guilty of marital infidelity, But that didn't mean he was guilty of murder. Eric wasn't on trial for being a bad person. He was on trial for murder. And the circumstantial evidence was not convincing enough to convict.
There are huge pieces at the center of the puzzle, but they are missing. You must come back with the verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Mr. Purdy.
In his summation, the prosecutor simply asked the jury to look at the whole picture. And if they did, the certainty of Eric's guilt would be clear.
You can see the
In his
writing
words,
on the wall.
you'll
We have
know
credible
he did it.
Witnesses that have no reason to lie. We have evidence.
The jury began their deliberations on Friday. The following Monday, they had reached a verdict.
There's a saying around the courthouse that once the summations are in and the jury goes back into that room, the saying is you never know what's going to happen. And it was certainly no different in this case.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, we have.
Bailiff?
The jury found Eric Napolitano guilty of murder.
Sentence hearing will be in 2 weeks.
He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 32.5 years.
This court is adjourned.
I was satisfied, the Acevedo family was satisfied that we had finally stopped this individual who had certainly killed before, and there was a real good chance he was going to do it again if we didn't band together and convict him and put him in jail for the rest of his life.
Investigators continued to develop leads in the killing of Marilyn Coludro. 12 years after the young woman's body was found at a park in Pennsylvania, Eric Napolitano was finally indicted for her murder. He agreed to plead guilty. The prosecutors believed that Eric's plea was prompted by a desire to protect his mother. Carolyn Napolitano was facing charges that she obstructed justice. During the investigations, she had provided alibis for Eric.
Ultimately, we made an offer to the Napolitanos that we would allow Carolyn into what they call pre-trial intervention. She goes on probation, and when it's over, the case is dismissed against her, if, and only if, Eric Napolitano would come clean about one of the other murders.
As the court listened in stunned silence, Eric confessed to the murder of his girlfriend, Marilyn Coludro.
Lay down on that. Eric Napolitano.
He was sentenced to an additional 15 years to life.
15 years, in addition to the sentence that you are now serving.
And by having another conviction in New York, we felt that we could guarantee that Eric would spend the rest of his life in jail without ever hoping for parole.
As part of Eric's plea agreement, his mother was not prosecuted for her role in any crimes. A New York Police Department internal affairs inquiry eventually filed disciplinary charges against her. Carolyn was accused of providing false information in the investigations into the murders of Gladys Matos and Marilyn Coludro. In 1997, on the eve of a hearing to decide her future, Carolyn Napolitano resigned. When the women in Eric's life tried to leave him, he murdered them. Convicted of 2 brutal slayings, Eric Napolitano will spend the rest of his life behind bars. On May 19, 1998, tragedy strikes Lincoln County High School. The small town is shocked as a national wave of schoolyard shootings comes violently home. And a local prosecutor fights for reason and justice in the midst of controversy. In the small town of Fayetteville, Tennessee, a high school honor student is tried for murder. The defense mounts a convincing case for leniency. But the prosecutor, as the chief law enforcement officer of the community that elected him, calls for punishment.
A school, to my way of thinking, deserves the same sanctity as a church. It's where a young person goes to learn. And if they can't feel safe there, where in God's world are they going to feel safe? And when one of these things happens, the justice has to be swift. A message has to go out there. We're not going to have kids carrying guns to school to kill kids.
May 19th, 1998. It was 3 days before graduation at Lincoln County High School in Fayetteville, Tennessee. There were proms, parties, and other celebrations. Seniors were looking forward to life after high school. Unfortunately, that day, the festive mood was marred by tragedy. Shortly after 2 p.m., Fayetteville Police Dispatch received a 911 call from the school secretary. She reported that a student had been shot in the school parking lot, and the shooter was still at the scene.
We've had a shooting at the high school, and they get on over pretty quick.
Fayetteville Police Investigator Bill Wood was the first to respond to the scene. In this episode, the names of some of the witnesses have been changed to protect their identity. When he arrived, Detective Wood saw a young man lying on the ground. A teacher said the victim's name was Nick Creason. He had been shot several times. He appeared to be unconscious. Another teacher told Wood the student who fired the shots, Jacob Davis, was sitting on the ground nearby. A faculty member had retrieved the weapon.
Jacob Davis, how about you?
Investigator Wood placed Davis under arrest.
Jacob, just to me, showed no emotion. When I had my hand on him, there was no trembling, there was no crying. You know, he wasn't upset at all. I said, "How old are you?" He said, "I'm 18. I advised him of his rights. I said, "Do you want to make a statement to me?" And he said, "I just need an attorney."
At 18, Jacob Davis was barely an adult in the eyes of the law. If his victim died, he would be charged with the most serious of crimes. Had the shooting occurred just a few months earlier, he would have been charged as a juvenile. Paramedics determined that Creason was alive, but he had sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. His condition was critical. Emergency room staff rushed to save the life of the young man, but he suffered from massive internal damage. One lung was punctured, a major artery was severed, and when his pulse began to drop, they could do little to sustain his life for more than a few moments. In the high school parking lot, Investigator Wood secured the crime scene and began processing evidence. Police recovered the weapon used in the shooting, a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. They also found 3 bullet casings near the victim's body.
take a look at this.
Investigators examined a car that witnesses said belonged to Jacob Davis, the alleged shooter. The vehicle contained valuable evidence that would later be used by prosecutors. They recovered a box of CCI 22 Magnum shells and a handwritten note. Later, Detective Wood went to the hospital to check on the victim's condition.
Where's the morgue? When I arrived, of course, I found out that the victim was deceased. He had been shot multiple times.
With Nick Creason dead, Investigator Wood collected the victim's clothing and personal items and entered them into evidence.
Thank you.
The autopsy was performed by medical examiner Dr. Charles Harlan.
Each of the 3 gunshot wounds in this case that caused the death of Nick Creason is in and of itself a fatal wound. The most devastating wound is the wound which goes through the heart, the right lung, the pulmonary artery, and the aorta. This is a type of wound which does not allow itself to be readily surgically repaired.
Jacob Davis was charged with first-degree murder, carrying a weapon on school property, and reckless endangerment with a weapon. He still refused to make a statement. Detective Wood interviewed several witnesses, including over a dozen students who helped him piece together what had happened that tragic afternoon.
I want to go over some of the details as to what happened to talk about today.
One of the student witnesses was Susie Wilkins, a friend of Nick Creason's. She was in the unfortunate position of having seen the whole incident in grisly detail. She explained that she was walking with Nick, heading toward his truck. Then she and Nick were confronted by Jacob Davis, who was wielding a rifle. Susie said 3 shots were fired. After the first shot, Nick held up his books in a futile attempt to deflect the next bullet.
I didn't know where it came from. And
Shop teacher Ricky Bryant was also on the
looked
scene.
up. I went running out the door and then heard another gunshot.
Somebody call 911, Nick.
As a student rushed to the side of the victim, Bryant picked up the rifle to keep Jacob Davis from shooting anyone else. Eyewitnesses said Jacob Davis never uttered a word during the incident. When he was finished shooting, he sat and waited for the police. After the murder, investigators found several clues in Jacob Davis's car, including a letter he had written. The note was addressed to friends, family, Carol, all. In the first paragraph of the letter, Jacob wrote, "I don't know what will happen to me this evening. I guess this will be goodbye should something happen to myself and I am not able to speak to those dearest to me." He went on to express his love for his family and friends, but he reserved a special part of the letter for someone named Carol. Detective Wood located Carol Taylor, a senior at Lincoln County High School, and he would soon learn that the young woman was at the center of the tragedy. In the aftermath of the fatal shooting of Lincoln County High School senior Nicholas Creason by fellow student Jacob Davis, Fayetteville police investigator Bill Wood was faced with the task of piecing together the events that led up to the tragedy. Detective Wood found a letter in Jacob's car. Much of the letter was directed to another student named Carol Taylor.
Why would he not get much sleep?
In his interview with Carol, Wood learned that she and Jacob had been dating for about 6 months. They met at a restaurant where they both worked. Jacob became so enamored with Carol that he turned down a scholarship from Mississippi State University, choosing instead to join Carol at the local community college. Carol told Detective Wood that before she dated Jacob, she dated the victim, Nick Creason.
Yeah, we've been dating for a while.
She explained that while she was dating Jacob, she secretly spent Valentine's Day with Nick and had sex. Eventually, Jacob found out.
Within the hour,
According to Carol, there was visible tension between the young men in the months leading up to the murder.
Do you understand me? You understand me?
Wait, no.
Though the two never came to blows, there were several confrontations both on and off school grounds. She also told Detective Wood about an incident that had occurred on the night before the murder.
Well, I think I'm not pregnant.
While she and Jacob were shopping for a home pregnancy test, Carol made a confession.
Last time.
It was a couple of months ago.
She told him that she had shopped for a pregnancy test a few months earlier when she thought she may have been pregnant with Nick Creason's child.
Something happened.
According to Carol, Jacob Davis had an extremely emotional, angry reaction.
It's no big deal.
The confession confirmed that her affair with Nick was more serious than she had led him to believe. Jacob collected himself, and he and Carol were intimate again later that night.
You knew both of these guys.
According to Carol, on the morning of the murder, Susie Wilkins tossed a penny that hit Carol.
Hey, man, are you trying to start something with me?
The incident resulted in a stare-down between Jacob and Nick, but the young men were able to leave it there for the moment. Then, later in the day, Jacob confronted Nick as he and Carol were heading into their math class. Sensing things could turn violent, Carol intervened.
You and me, right? Four or 5 months.
Based on information he received from Carol Taylor and several other witnesses, Investigator Wood put together the rest of the tragedy's timeline.
Jacob, who lived 12 miles from the school in the Syerston community, had left the school, gone home, gotten the rifle and the ammunition, and returned to the school. Before arriving, he stopped on the side of the road and wrote the letter that we found in the car.
Then at 2 p.m., Jacob Davis returned to the school. Within the hour, Nick Creason would be dead. Three days after the murder at the Lincoln County Courthouse, Davis was arraigned for his crimes, including first-degree murder. An hour later, down the block at Higgins Funeral Home, a service was held for Nicholas Creason. He was buried in Boonville Cemetery. And still later that same day, the grief-stricken Lincoln County High School class of 1998 graduated. They were minus 2 students, one dead, the other in jail for murder. A student wearing Nick Creason's football jersey accepted his diploma for him. Prosecuting Jacob Davis was Lincoln County District Attorney General Mike McCown.
This was a highly emotional thing. It involved my hometown. Certainly, I know a lot of people at school who were very emotionally tied up in this. And I listened to a lot of them, listened to their feelings on what they thought happened and what they thought should be done.
The day of the murder, criminal defense attorney Ray Fraley received a call from Jacob Davis's father.
And his son was being held in jail, and he asked me to go down and see him. And I told him at that point that I just didn't know that I could get involved with a local case. I've tried 6 or 7 first-degree murder cases and several homicide cases, but this was just too close. I mean, the principal of the high school was a close friend of mine. Nick Creason was a football player, and his coach, Lewis Thompson, was a close friend of mine, and I just didn't know if I could get myself involved in that type of a case. Hello. Hi, Lawrence. Did you talk
After
to
a
me?
second call from Jacob's father, Ray Fraley agreed to take the case.
Get up, you have a visitor.
I knew immediately by talking to him that he needed help. I got him out of the cell, sat him down in the library of the jail, and we talked for an hour or so. I couldn't get a lot out of him because he was in a complete stupor. I mean, he was in shock. I just wanted to really sit there and comfort him more than anything and let him know that he had somebody that was going to be with him side by side through this tragedy and the procedures that go with these kind of cases.
I didn't commit any...
As Jacob Davis's attorney, Ray Fraley's first priority was to prevent the state from seeking the death penalty against his client.
I met with the DA, a friend of mine, Mike McCown. And of course, he was under a great deal of pressure from the community and the nation at large, I guess, because of the way these things were happening.
In order to seek the death penalty in Tennessee, one of 13 criteria must be met. The criteria include that there be multiple victims, or that the victims be law enforcement officers or judges.
It was my opinion that given all the circumstances, that this was either a life or life without parole situation as opposed to a death penalty situation.
So the defense and prosecution agreed that the death penalty would not be pursued. The prosecution and defense agreed to select a jury from outside the county. Fayetteville, Tennessee is 80 miles south of Nashville, about 30 miles north of Alabama. Fayetteville's population is around 7,500. Everyone in the small town knew about the tragedy at Lincoln County High School. Finding an impartial jury that had not heard of the case would be difficult.
But Mike McCown, the prosecutor, and I both agreed that it would be impossible, virtually impossible, to get a jury in Lincoln County. Everybody centers, our community centers around that high school. And either folks here were directly involved, perhaps with the shooting in that one of their children may have witnessed it, and or teachers were there and students have teachers. It was just a strange situation for us, and that was on both sides.
Jurors would be bussed in from nearby Dixon County. Dixon County was chosen because it resembles Lincoln County's geographical, social, and economic features. The day before Jacob Davis's trial, the jury was brought to the Lincoln County Courthouse. They would be sequestered until the trial's end. The trial began on July 26, 1999, a year and 2 months after the murder took place.
In this case, I didn't think of Jacob Davis as being a defendant. He was an accused, but he was a young man who needed help. He was a young man who had never experienced anything like this in his life, had nothing in his background to indicate that this would ever happen. and nothing in his background to indicate it would ever happen again. An isolated incident.
Certainly there was more than one victim in this case. And I suppose maybe that Davis, some considered him a victim too, but he chose to take the law in his own hands and execute somebody. And I have a hard time feeling sorry for him.
Ultimately, the jury would have to learn about the circumstances that led up to the murder, Jacob Davis's psychological state, and most importantly, why he murdered his classmate.
All rise. The court of the Honorable Judge Charles Lee is now in session.
Be seated. The State of Tennessee versus Jacob Davis. Mr. McGowan, your opening statement, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Your Honor.
Prosecutor Mike McCown began his opening
Morning, ladies and
statement
gentlemen
by
of the
telling
jury.
the jury that they would see that the murder of Nick Creason was premeditated.
In order to convict someone of first-degree murder in Tennessee, you must prove that it was an unlawful, intentional, premeditated crime. On the 19th day of May, 1998, there were several things that happened that indicated that Davis was thinking about doing harm to Creason.
Took place.
Mike
The
McCown
evidence will
also
show
argued
this
that
man,
Davis was of sound
Jacob
mind at
Davis,
the time of the shooting.
with premeditated murder and forethought, shot to
For the
death a
prosecution,
young man,
the
Nicholas
murder
Creason.
was a classic case of
But
lovers'
it's an easy
jealousy
choice.
that
We'll take you through the
exploded into
evidence,
violence.
and it will lead you to one conclusion, that Jacob Davis is guilty. Thank you.
You have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
In his opening statement, Ray Fraley argued that Jacob Davis suffered from diminished mental capacity.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What we have is
Fraley
a
contended
teenage
that his
tragedy.
client was severely depressed,
Jacob
sleep
Davis.
deprived for a period of months leading up to the murder, and that he heard voices.
Didn't have full mental capacity of killing Nick Creason.
The diminished capacity defense should not be confused with a better-known insanity defense.
Well, insanity, if you are shown to be insane, then that's a complete defense. You can be exonerated, found not guilty by insanity. But to suffer a diminished capacity, that's not really a defense in a sense that you can completely avoid culpability. It just means that the jury can consider whether or not there was a requisite intent to form premeditation for a first-degree
What
murder.
we have is a teenage tragedy.
For the defense,
Jacob
the
Davis,
tragedy could not be dismissed as a case of lovers' jealousy. It was about a young man
Didn't
who
have full
became
mental
mentally
capacity of
unbalanced
killing Nick
and
Creason.
eventually snapped.
But we submit that he's not guilty.
Fraley argued that his
of
client should be
first-degree murder.
convicted of a lesser crime than first-degree murder, such as second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter.
Prosecution, you may call your next witness.
Several students testified at the trial. The most anticipated testimony came from the young lady who found herself in the center of this tragedy, Carol Taylor.
Swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
The prosecution questioned Carol about her relationship with both the
Can you
defendant
tell us
and the
about
victim.
how long you dated?
Carol told the jury how Jacob Davis learned of
About
the Valentine's Day tryst she
4 or 5
had
months,
with Nick
but you've known him for
Creason.
quite some time, is that correct?
Yes.
Word of the affair got out 2 months before the murder in Mrs. Roberts' fourth period physics class.
Stuff like that, but I mean, it's okay if you talk to him.
I don't even know what she was thinking. They were like almost fighting.
A friend of Jacob's overheard students discussing the affair with the teacher. It wasn't long before Jacob learned of Carol's infidelity.
What?
Yo, it's Nick, man.
Are you kidding me?
No.
The news devastated him.
Stop messing with me, man.
On my mind.
On the afternoon Jacob found out about the affair, he and Carol had a heated discussion in the school's parking lot.
Just listen what I have to say. Come on!
You took a gun
The
to school?
argument ended 4 hours later when Jacob handed Carol a letter. It was the first of 3 letters written by the defendant that the jury would hear read aloud during the trial.
Lincoln County High School.
How long have you
The
known?
prosecution hoped the letter would help convince the jury that the murder of Nick Creason was premeditated. It
I'd
was
like you to
written
read this
2
letter out
months
loud
before the
for
shooting.
the record.
Read it all?
Just read it all and try to speak up.
I don't deserve this, Carol. From the beginning, I have given you nothing but my all. And for what? To be with you. That is all I have asked. I'm faithful. I'm true. I'm honest. My heart screams, how could you? And you talk about your night at work. I bleed, and for that he should bleed as well. My friends say I should take this anger out on you. You know as well as I do I can't do that. It must go somewhere, thus this letter.
Jacob Davis went on to further declare
you feel
both
when you
his
read the
love
letter?
for Carol and disappointment in her.
I was a little worried.
For prosecutor Mike McCown, Jacob's violent words against Nick Creason were strong evidence that the crime was premeditated.
Now, this was approximately 60 days before the murder, so that told us that he was evidently entertaining these violent thoughts for a long period of time before he actually committed the murder.
Yes.
But the same piece of
What was his
evidence
reaction?
could be interpreted 2 ways.
He was okay.
And the defense had its own interpretation
About
of the letter.
7 or 8, I guess.
I used it to show that this was a pattern of deterioration, which supported my position that he had suffered and was suffering a diminished capacity to form the requisite intent.
During any of the visits that you went to see the defendant,
The prosecution believed the defendant was in
Did you
control
ever
of
ask him
himself
why
when
he
he shot the victim. They hoped that Carol Taylor's testimony would support their argument.
Did you see any great change in him at all during the months of April or May of that year?
He seemed happier.
Happier?
Yeah, happier.
Carol
And for what
testified
purposes
that in the months leading up to the murder,
did you go to Walmart?
Jacob's anger actually seemed to
Tell the truth.
subside. She testified about the incident at the drugstore. She claimed that Jacob recovered quickly after hearing the news that she had shopped for a pregnancy test once before with Nick Creason.
Something happened.
He gave you the letter.
The prosecution later questioned Carol about the numerous times she visited Jacob
Was he
in
upset?
jail after he committed the murder.
Yes.
The prosecution hoped her testimony about the visits would demonstrate that Jacob was of sound mind shortly after the murder,
Jacob?
that he knew what he had done,
Hey.
and he had no regrets.
Okay. You okay?
About how many times did you see him?
About, I don't remember, about 7 or 8, I guess.
And during any of these visits that you went to see the defendant, Jacob Davis, did you ever ask him why he shot Nick Creason?
Yes.
What did he say?
He said, you know why, but I can't tell you. I can't say.
In his cross-examination, defense attorney Ray Fraley attempted to get Carol Taylor to
State your
paint a
name
very
again.
different picture of Jacob Davis.
Carol Taylor.
The defense asked Carol about the night before the murder, when she and Jacob shopped for a pregnancy test.
First, when you got to the store, you mentioned to Jacob that you had been there before for one of these tests. And you had been with Nick Creason sometime before?
Yes.
What you didn't tell the jury, I don't think you left it out on purpose, you weren't asked. Jacob Davis collapsed on the floor
Yes.
and cried
Yes.
uncontrollably.
Yes.
Why would you bring up his name?
Ray Fraley used Carol Taylor's
Yes.
testimony to support his contention that Jacob was suffering from sleep deprivation prior to the murder.
During this period of time after this march, there is no question in your mind, is there, that he was absolutely sleep deprived?
No.
You could see it. He was getting haggard, wasn't he?
Yes.
You were concerned about his health.
Yes.
So this young man on the night of the pregnancy test and the episode that you have described at your house, went home and you met him the next morning at 7 or so.
Yes.
Again, he hadn't had any sleep, had he?
No.
At Shoney's and with you, he seemed to be all right.
Yes.
Sort of a security, wasn't it?
Yes.
Then we went to the first exam, which is physics.
Yes.
Did you have that class with him?
Yes.
He didn't even take the exam, did he?
No.
The same young man who on the night before was out of control, crying, shaking, begging you, wrote a letter.
Yes.
All of these things were happening in his life. Uncontrollable bouts of crying and shaking at various times, including the times that were not mentioned in the car with him, where he would just lose it. All of these times were times that Mr. McCowan expressed to you were times of utter happiness for Jacob Davis.
Yes.
That wasn't so, was he?
No.
Did he seem fine?
He seemed fine. When he left, he was fine. Said he was okay.
Do you recognize
Lincoln
this letter?
County High School teacher Tiffany
If you would,
Roberts took
please
the
read
stand.
the contents of that letter.
She taught the victim in a separate class. News of the affair between Carol and Nick first leaked out in one of Mrs. Roberts' classes. Roberts testified that on the morning of the murder, Jacob Davis took his final physics exam. After he handed in his test, he wrote a 2-page letter and gave it to her. She read the letter later in the day. It began by expressing Jacob's dissatisfaction with the education system.
Knowledge leads me to question the word bestow. The education system in this country, this state, verified this country is quite simply a farce. For the past 12 years, I have simply been bored.
Jacob went on to accuse Mrs. Roberts of participating in gossip surrounding Carol and Nick Creason.
But you dealt me a very devastating personal insult earlier this year by discussing my personal life with that Nicholas Creason. You were a large part of the greatest pain I have ever known, a pain which nearly caused me to take my own life.
Mrs. Roberts testified that after reading the letter, she rushed the note to the school's principal, Jim Stewart. He tried to track down Jacob, but couldn't find him. Jacob had already gone home to pick up the rifle. The jury would hear a third and final letter written by the defendant. Investigator Bill Wood took the stand.
Yes, I did. This is what was found in Mr. Davis's car.
Much of the letter was written to Carol and detailed Jacob's anger toward Nick.
All I ever wanted was to love and be loved by you. I gave you everything, and it is so sad that you could not return my devotion. So now I cut myself from that. I lust to kill him.
The prosecution and the defense both used Jacob's letters to support their arguments.
The letters were varied, but in my opinion, they showed the deterioration of Jacob's mental state, which gave rise to the argument of diminished capacity. The state, on the other hand, used these letters to show an absolute jealous rage on the part of Jacob Davis. So it was a double-edged sword, without question.
The defense argued that Jacob's deteriorating mental state led to the shooting.
Prior to the killing, is that not correct?
But the prosecution claimed that the murder was motivated by lovers' jealousy.
He's always been a bit sensitive.
Now, expert witnesses from both sides would take the stand. Jacob's fate would depend on who the jury believed. Although there was plenty of emotional testimony at Jacob Davis's trial, The centerpiece of his defense's argument was a very scientific one, that he was suffering from a diminished mental capacity and was unable to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. Key to proving the defense's argument was child psychologist Dr. William Kenner of Nashville. Dr. Kenner interviewed Jacob Davis a year before the trial.
I do.
Dr. Kenner is a noted psychologist, and particularly in fields of diminished capacity. And he agreed with me that there was something in this child's past that appeared after everything was taken into consideration, the totality of all the circumstances of this young man's life, that in fact he was, at the time of this tragedy, suffering from a diminished capacity.
At trial, all of these folks testified, and their experts testified that he did suffer from diminished capacity, and the states testified that he didn't. And it got down to a question of fact for the jury, and they made their call based on what they heard from the psychiatric testimony.
Doctor.
Several months before the trial, Dr. Kenner met with Jacob Davis in prison. The defense asked Dr. Kenner for his diagnosis.
Psychotic features.
According to Dr. Kenner, Jacob suffered from severe major depression and what he termed were psychotic features, such as hearing voices.
Have you tried to sleep?
A major depression with psychotic features will often have voices, as Jacob described. In his case, as in many other cases, the voices were not ones that were command hallucinations where God or someone important was telling him to do something. Rather, it was like a Greek chorus in the background that was mumbling about how worthless he was, so that when he became more upset, when things were more difficult for him, the voices simply got louder.
The defense's claim that Jacob Davis was hearing voices caught the prosecution by surprise.
That's the first we ever heard of any voices. It was not in any of the reports. It didn't come back in any other form whatsoever until the psychiatrist got on the witness stand and testified about the voices.
On antidepressants.
Dr. Kenner testified that both sides of Jacob Davis's family had a history of severe depression.
Jacob's family has a history
An
of
aunt
depression.
had even committed suicide.
I understand that.
In this history,
Fraley asked the doctor if the emotions that had been aroused in Davis were so significant that they removed him from reality. The doctor testified that the emotions were very intense, and his ability to control those emotions was significantly diminished because of his psychosis.
Mr. Bernard, you want to start your questioning?
The prosecution attempted to counter the defense's diminished mental capacity argument with a rebuttal witness, psychiatrist Dr. Rokia Farouk of the Tennessee Mental Health Institute.
Did you form an opinion?
Our opinion at that time of the incident was he was not suffering from any kind of mental disease or defect that is going to make him incapable of forming intent.
Intent to commit the crime was possible, Dr. Farouk testified, because although Jacob Davis was depressed, the level of depression was not so severe that it rendered him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
The state's experts actually agreed with much of what I was saying. Where they disagreed was in terms of how severely depressed he was, because they evaluated him a year and a half, I believe, after the crime.
Dr. Farouk,
the defense pointed out that the state psychiatrists based their testimony on evaluations they made over a year after the crime, and after Jacob had received treatment for depression from prison psychiatrists. As for the argument that Jacob may have been hearing voices, Dr. Farouk testified that hearing of voices can be normal in certain situations.
Honest
You don't give it much importance that the young man was hearing voices. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
You all disagree about that, right?
Yes.
They didn't deny, they being the experts for the state, didn't deny that Jacob was undergoing some emotional trauma. But they didn't think it arose to the level of diminished capacity.
Well, tell me this, Dr. Farouk.
Defense attorney McGee wrapped up the cross-examination by challenging
disagree on
Dr.
a
Farouk's
topic.
testimony that Jacob Davis's depression was not severe.
Possible that one of
He
them
pointed out that Dr. Farouk herself prescribed an antidepressant for Jacob Davis while she evaluated him.
do
Dr.
normal
Farouk
people
testified
hear
that the
voices?
antidepressant also worked for
Sometimes it's a
mild
normal
depression.
hallucination.
Dr. Farouk, you're excused. Thank you. Mr. McCowan, are you ready for your
For
closing
all of the
remarks?
psychological arguments the defense made,
Ladies and gentlemen
the
of the
crux
jury,
of the
over the past
prosecution's
days,
argument was based on physical evidence and eyewitness accounts
Exposed to a lot of information, a lot of testimony. I realize that's a lot
that
to
Jacob
process.
Davis had spent months thinking about the murder.
She took the stand.
The prosecution referred to the many letters that Jacob Davis had
Davis
written
wrote
that could be interpreted
well
to
before
show
he killed
premeditation.
Killed the victim.
Even on the day of the murder, the prosecution contended, he had plenty of time to think about his crime and reconsider as he drove the 12 miles each way to and from his house to pick up the rifle he used in the killing. The prosecution had evidence that he lay in wait for 20 minutes before ambushing Nick Creason. And then there was the act itself. And the time it took to reload. And reload yet again.
Yes, Your Honor.
During closing arguments, defense attorney Ray Fraley told the jury that the murder was a teenage tragedy. And he urged the jury to
Ladies and
convict Jacob
gentlemen
Davis
of the
of a
jury.
lesser crime than first-degree murder.
He's not innocent. He is guilty of killing Nick Creason. But we submit that he is not guilty of first-degree murder.
Shortly after the closing arguments, the jury was given the case and sent to deliberate. The jury could find Davis guilty of voluntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, or first-degree murder. After a week of testimony, the fate of young Jacob Davis was now in the jury's hands. High school honor student Jacob Davis was accused of murdering fellow classmate Nick Creason. His fate was in the hands of the jury, which was deciding whether to convict
Mr.
Davis of voluntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, or first-degree murder.
Yes, we have, Your Honor.
Bill? Will the defendant please stand?
We, the jury, find Jacob Davis guilty of first-degree murder.
It took the jury 4 hours to return a verdict. The prosecutors got what they wanted. The jury found Jacob Davis guilty of first-degree murder. In a minor victory for the defense, the jury allowed for the possibility of parole. Under Tennessee law, the minimum time Jacob Davis will serve before he's eligible will be 51 years, when he will be 70 years old.
The jury, the state of Tennessee, thanks you for your contribution in this case. You are excused.
Despite the minor victory, defense attorney Ray Fraley was disappointed in the verdict and the sentence.
It is, if not draconian, just absolutely unbelievable to me that thinking of Jacob Davis as a 18-year-old boy, 55 years in prison, but that's the law. as it presently exists.
Prosecutor Mike McCown felt differently.
In the case of Nicholas Creason, eternity is forever. The sentence that Davis imposed on him has no possibility of parole and no possibility of commutation by a governor. He is dead and will be dead eternally.
Jacob Davis is now serving time in a Tennessee prison. When asked what he would say to the victim's parents, he had this to say.
There's no way that I could ever fully realize what they've gone through. But as much as I can, you know, as much as I do understand, you know, I'm sorry. I would give anything to take this back. I would give anything to change this. I never wanted all this to happen. I don't understand how it did happen, but it did, and it's on my hands. And I'd do anything. I'd do anything to take it back.
After Jacob Davis's trial, Mike McCown told the press that he hoped the harsh sentence Jacob Davis received would send a message that society was not going to tolerate guns being taken to school. Although the message may have been sent, sadly, it has not been heard. The tragedy of the Lincoln County High School has since been overshadowed by several other higher-profile school shootings. One occurred just 2 days after Jacob Davis murdered Nick Creason. In Springfield, Oregon, a student named Kip Kinkle shot and killed his parents. He then went to school and shot several students. And on April 20th, 1999, 2 students walked into Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, and opened fire, killing 12 students and 1 teacher in the worst school massacre in U.S. history. Today, Jacob Davis's mother, Phyllis, works at the same restaurant she worked at before the shooting. She is still struggling to understand what went wrong in Jacob's life during his last 2 years at the Fayetteville High School.
I feel totally and absolutely guilty because I was in denial that anything could be wrong with Jacob Davis. We just didn't see what was going on inside. And I think that's a parent's responsibility above everything else, is to know what's going on inside your kids. You don't let the TV raise your kids. You don't turn them over to the computer. You don't turn them over to the school. You know what's going on in their lives. And during those 2 years, we didn't know. We honestly did not know what was going on.
Jacob Davis's crime left many victims in its wake. A community badly shaken, a promising young man dead, and Davis himself in prison for at least 51 years. District Attorney General Mike McCown had won a conviction, but ultimately there can be no winners in the wake of such an American tragedy. On a summer night in 1998, a policeman is gunned down in Houston, Texas. And a vicious killer goes on the run. Authorities launch a manhunt. And the prosecutors fight for justice in the case of a cold-blooded murderer who claims he is a victim of police brutality, concealed by a code of silence. A 25-year-old police officer was brutally shot to death after crossing paths with a suspected gang member in Houston, Texas. To obtain justice, prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal would have to take a tragic journey through the wasted lives of a promising young police officer and a hardened teenage killer.
It was a very ironic situation that both these kids basically came from the same neighborhood as they started out. Both the kids really came from very similar backgrounds. One kid went one way and one went the other.
September 29th, 1998. For Deputy Constables Michael Eakin and Matthew McCord, the night had started out like any other. The two officers had been on patrol in Houston's North End, conducting radar checks for speeding vehicles. The air was hot, still, and thick with humidity, typical for Houston, Texas in late summer. It was a few minutes past midnight when a Cadillac sped by.
Okay. All right, this is Eakin, dispatch, radio check.
Deputy Eakin pursued the speeding vehicle into a deserted parking lot alongside the Hardy Toll Road, a drab stretch of highway that connects the airport to downtown Houston. As the Cadillac stopped, Eakin reported his location to dispatch.
Tom George, Tom 27 George.
The deputy got out of his vehicle and approached the car.
What is this?
Shoot.
There were 6 teenagers in the Cadillac.
All right.
He asked to see their
I'm gonna
identification.
need to see some IDs, people.
If any of the car's occupants were under 18, they were in violation of the city's 11 p.m. curfew. One young man in the back seat failed to produce an ID.
All right, get out of the car. Get out of the car, sir. Everyone keep your hands
Eakin
where I
had
can
him
see
step out of the car and began to frisk the subject.
them. Down, sir.
Suddenly, the young man broke away and ran into a nearby field. Deputy Eakin pursued him, and the two disappeared into the darkness.
Tom 13.
Seconds later, the constable's dispatch received a brief, garbled radio transmission from Eakin. The dispatcher asked the deputy to clarify, but there was no response.
8100 to 1 Tom 16.
Alarmed, the dispatcher contacted Deputy McCord.
Tom 16, yes sir, I need you to put yourself en route to 13300 East Hardy. I need you to check by with Tom 13.
She gave him the location of the traffic stop, asking him to drive by to see if Eakin needed assistance.
South.
Within minutes, McCord was on the scene. He spotted the patrol car of his friend Michael Eakin. It was empty, parked behind a Cadillac with 5 teenage occupants.
Need you to exit the car on the driver's side only.
Deputy Eakin was nowhere in sight.
Exit the car, driver's side only. Keep your hands where I can see them. Lay face down on the ground. Keep your hands out in front of you. Where is he at? Where is he at?
He went that way, running after Jose.
Running where?
He went that way, running after Jose.
This is McCord. I need back up.
Boy 15, go to civil. 1 David 18, traffic.
Units responded from the Harris County Constable's Office, the Sheriff's Department, and the Houston Police Department.
Okay, keep your hands where we can see them. Keep them just where they are. What do we got?
All right, sir, when I came on the scene, there were these 5 suspects.
McCord briefed the
in car. I've got
officers,
them
who
on the
immediately
ground.
cordoned off the area and began searching the
Hands
property.
back, please. Right there.
They were hopeful that the missing deputy was still out there, perhaps trying to find the man who had fled from the traffic stop. But Deputy Eakin had not responded on his radio. Something was wrong. In a nearby field, officers saw a figure lying still in the grass. It was Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. He had been fatally shot in the throat.
There's nothing here. What do you got, Joe? I don't have any pulse. No pulse?
The young occupants in the car, out well after Houston's 11 p.m. curfew for minors, were searched for weapons and taken into custody. They, along with the passenger who had fled, were now suspects in a homicide. They were tested for powder burns, a telltale sign of having just fired a weapon.
Okay, turn that hand over.
No powder residue was found.
All right.
I did it.
All right.
Harris County Assistant District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal was called to the scene and arrived shortly before dawn. According to policy at the Harris County District Attorney's Office, a prosecutor is assigned to a case at the very beginning of an investigation whenever a law enforcement officer is wounded or killed.
I guess the thing that struck me immediately upon seeing him was how young he looked. And the bullet wound to his neck was the only one that I saw that I took to be a contact wound.
Hopefully they can get out of here.
Near the body, detectives found a clue left by the killer. A small medallion and chain. The image depicted on the medallion was of a man sitting in an electric chair. Inscribed on the back was the name of a gangster rap company. The medallion was covered in blood. Monitoring police communications, television news crews quickly descended on the crime scene. There, they interviewed Chief J.C. Mosier of the Harris County Constable's Office, Precinct 1.
It's going to be tough. We got a lot of people in the department that are still asleep, don't even know it's happened, and they're going to be coming to work finding out that the first officer in the history of our department has been killed in the line of duty. So it's going to be rough. This is just one of those terrible, tragic things that happens in the life of police officers and police departments, unfortunately.
Multiple law enforcement agencies were called out in force. Not only had an officer been murdered, but an armed fugitive was still on the loose. Teams mobilized to continue processing the crime scene and to find Michael Eakin's killer. But in a city of nearly 2 million people, if the shooter was not found quickly, he could easily blend in or escape the city limits entirely.
You want to get out and check that quantum?
The 5 passengers of the vehicle, now in custody at Harris County's Homicide Division, were questioned by detectives of the Sheriff's Department.
A police officer was killed tonight.
In this episode, the names of some of the witnesses have been changed to protect their identity. Detectives informed the teenagers they were involved in a capital crime, the fatal shooting of a police officer. They were separated and questioned individually. One of the teens admitted to lying to police about the identity of the young man who had fled the scene of the crime.
Is the police officer that got shot tonight? All right. Who was in the car with your other?
His name was not Jose, as they had claimed hours earlier. The man police were looking for was Michael Anthony Lopez. He had run off, his friend said, because he believed there was a warrant out for his arrest,
You understand you're not under arrest?
and he did not want to go back to jail. Investigators ran a check on Michael Anthony Lopez and discovered he was a 17-year-old with a lengthy police record. At the time of the deputy's murder, Lopez was in violation of his parole. The district attorney's office issued an arrest warrant on the charge of capital murder. With the identity of the suspect established, the search was intensified. Police combed the area looking for any other clues that would tie Lopez to the murder. And they still had not found the murder weapon. With an armed cop killer on the loose, investigators knew they had to find their suspect quickly. Anyone coming into contact with the killer before authorities could find him was in danger. It was late summer of 1998 in Houston, Texas, and a young police officer had been gunned down after making a routine traffic stop. Evidence technicians painstakingly combed the crime scene to find any clues left behind by the killer. The suspect in the killing, 17-year-old Michael Lopez, was still on the loose. He was armed and considered extremely dangerous. Police searched through the night in the surrounding neighborhoods. On the morning of September 29th, 6 hours after the shooting of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin, Houston Police, Sheriff's Department, and Constable's Office personnel were briefed on the shooting and given a description of the suspect. They joined in the manhunt.
And the note of caution. Now, we're stressing you.
Investigators also began checking with the suspect's friends and family. According to juvenile records, his father was in jail and his mother's whereabouts were unknown. Lopez had been living with his grandparents about 3 miles from the scene of the shooting. Early that morning, Harris County deputies were dispatched to the home of Maria and Carlos Lopez. The elderly couple told police they had not seen their grandson for over a week. Investigators also learned that Lopez spent much of his time at the home of Elena Vasquez, his girlfriend. Elena and her sister Rosa told detectives that they had not heard from Lopez in weeks. Mark Schmidt, a sheriff's detective assigned to the case, had his doubts.
Of course, one of the things you're going to wonder about is, are they being on the up and up? Are they being honest with you?
Elena and her sister gave the detectives a few photographs of Lopez. Schmidt noted that in one of the photos, Lopez was wearing the small yet distinctive medallion and chain that was found inches from Deputy Eakin's body. By the following afternoon, a mobile command center was established near the crime scene. This became a base of operations for the collection of evidence, the processing of tips, and the search for the fugitive. Scores of officers from multiple agencies were mobilized to participate in the investigation.
In Harris County, we've got several constable precincts who have patrol units. Many of those constables' offices responded to assist. The Sheriff's Department patrol, K-9 from the Sheriff's Department, a helicopter from the Sheriff's Department, State Highway Patrol, the Houston Police Department.
Investigators focused their search within a 2-mile perimeter of the crime scene. Details of the manhunt were sent to local news media, which broadcast a description of the fugitive. A police hotline was set up, and members of the community were urged to report anything suspicious. Deputies were in a race against time. An armed killer was on the loose, and as word spread, the community became more and more alarmed. The suspect would have little difficulty hiding out in the stakeout zone. The area was filled with block after block of low-income housing, warehouses, and abandoned buildings. As news of the shooting continued to spread, Leads began to accumulate. Each one was checked out. But as the day wore on, Lopez continued to elude authorities. The Harris County medical examiner gathered more information from the body of the victim, Michael Eakin. He had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the throat. The autopsy revealed that either of the bullet wounds would have been fatal. One bullet had entered his brain, instantly incapacitating him. The other bullet had severed the victim's spinal cord. Both bullets were recovered from Eakin's body by the medical examiner. The hunt for Eakin's suspected killer, Michael Lopez, intensified when a trail of blood was discovered near an intermediate school not far from the scene of the crime. Then another trail of blood was found on a nearby fence, and another on a driveway a few blocks away. Students were kept inside the school as canine units descended upon the location in an effort to track the killer by scent. Technicians recovered the blood samples for DNA analysis in the hope of matching them to the suspect once he was apprehended. A positive match would place the suspect at the crime scene. Canine units discovered another trail of blood on a nearby avenue. It continued behind a row of houses and a few blocks further along a gravel drive. But there, the trail ended. More than 12 hours after the murder of Deputy Michael Eakin, authorities were still no closer to finding his suspected killer.
The area that we were covering was probably about 2 square miles. You've got a lot of residences, schools. You got to wonder, did this person possibly slip into someone's home? Are they hiding in the home?
7124.
Later in the day, officers in the command post received an important lead. A resident within the stakeout zone called the hotline to report that she had discovered bloody clothing outside her home. Officers were immediately dispatched to the scene.
I'm so glad you're here. I called as soon as I found this stuff. I heard about it in the news.
Hidden near the foundation, detectives recovered a shirt caked with dried blood. Nearby was a hose and a puddle of water. It looked as if someone had tried to wash the blood off the shirt, but had given up and left it behind. The shirt matched the description of the one worn by the suspect, but it brought them no closer to finding Lopez.
So we were doing everything we could and going around individually checking residences for signs of being broke into. Knocking on doors, is everything okay? Are y'all all right? And have you had any strangers try to talk their way into your home today?
With scores of law enforcement personnel on the hunt for Michael Lopez, authorities hoped they were closing in on him. But they couldn't be sure.
We did everything we could to contain the area, but you still worry, is there some way that he might have slipped through this and could be gone?
At 2 p.m., more than 12 hours after the shooting, police received another lead to the suspect's possible whereabouts.
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, we're picking up a hitchhiker. We heard on
2 men who had seen a news story about the manhunt came to the command post, reporting that they had given a lift to a young man who fit the description of the suspect. They said they had dropped him off several miles from the crime scene. Now investigators were concerned that somehow Lopez had eluded them. If he had succeeded in getting another ride, he could be well out of the area. By nightfall, law enforcement officials had been split up into small groups and were combing the stakeout zone block by block in search of more blood trails, a weapon, or anything that would bring them closer to finding the suspect. The command center continued to field calls from the public, yet Lopez was still out there somewhere, and police seemed no closer to catching him. To the frustrated investigators, it was beginning to look like a suspected cop killer might have escaped. In a low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, investigators from a half-dozen law enforcement agencies conducted a massive investigation and manhunt for a suspect in the fatal shooting of a young police officer. It had been 24 hours since the investigation into the murder of Deputy Michael Eakin had begun. And while forensic investigators had collected blood samples and other evidence at the crime scene, there had been no significant leads to the whereabouts of the killer. Investigators widened their search for Michael Lopez. They still had not found the murder weapon, so they had to assume the suspect was still armed and prepared to kill again. Finally, there was a break in the case.
Yes, sir. A citizen called in, saw suspicious.
In the early morning of September 30th, police received 3 separate 911 calls from residents in the stakeout zone.
If it goes across the street.
The callers reported having seen a bare-chested man moving around the backyard of an abandoned house located about a mile from the last known blood trail.
Next to the school here.
Police and canine units were immediately dispatched to the address. The canine picked up a scent. Converging on a small wooden garage on the property, investigators approached cautiously. If this was the man they were looking for, they knew he wasn't afraid to kill a cop. Weapons drawn, officers moved inside. The dog charged forward as a bloody young man emerged from behind a refrigerator and surrendered. The man was escorted out of the building, his hand bleeding from an apparent gunshot wound. His face, arms, and chest were covered with scratches and dried blood. The young man was unarmed and had no identification, but he matched the description of the fugitive. When asked, he confirmed that his name was Michael Anthony Lopez. Suspected of having killed Deputy Michael Eakin, he was taken into custody. Lopez was brought to a clinic where doctors treated his wounds, after which he was booked. Police gave him something to eat and a soda. He had been on the run for more than 24 hours. A suspected cop killer had finally been apprehended. The mobile command unit at the crime scene could be dismantled, and a frightened community could relax. For the prosecution, however, the hard work was just beginning. The exhausted fugitive was interrogated by detectives. He seemed cooperative, answering all their questions.
Land there, that's right.
We got Mr. Rosenthal from the DA's.
When Assistant District Attorney Rosenthal arrived at the police station that morning, he was told that the suspect had given not one, but 2 written confessions. In both, he claimed that after being caught by Deputy Eakin, the 2 had scuffled and he had accidentally shot the officer. Rosenthal's first concern was that the suspect's rights had not been violated. With an eye toward an upcoming murder trial, he wanted to make sure the confessions would stand up in court.
One of the things I did when I first got there was I went up and talked to him myself. When Lopez was arrested, he was very dirty. He had a number of kind of small cuts and abrasions on him as if he'd been running through some briars. I asked him if he'd been treated fairly, and he was very matter of fact about the whole situation there. I mean, you would think that a young person who had been arrested for a capital crime, knowing he'd been arrested for a capital crime, would be intimidated by the situation or would be contrite, and I saw none of that in Michael Lopez.
Rosenthal was also perplexed by the suspect's gunshot wound. An examination of Deputy Eakin's gun, which was in his holster when his body was discovered, proved it had not been fired. Somehow, in the scuffle with Eakin, Lopez had shot himself with his own gun. Lopez was unclear on that point. There were also several inconsistencies in the suspect's 2 statements concerning the shooting of the officer. To gain a conviction, Rosenthal knew he would have to be able to explain to the jury step by step exactly what happened when the 2 men ran off into the darkness that fatal night.
No denying he shot Aiken.
When a detective informed Rosenthal that Lopez had agreed to do a video walkthrough in which police would tape a 3rd confession at the crime scene, Rosenthal seized the opportunity. That afternoon, the suspect was taken under heavy guard to the parking lot and field alongside the Hardy Toll Road. Lopez waived his right to have an attorney present.
I want you to tell me step by step what happened.
As a deputy recorded the suspect's statement with a video camera, Lopez told investigators his version of what happened the night of the shooting. From the beginning, Lopez maintained it was an accident.
All right, well, show me then where you run to.
Right.
Lopez claimed that he had been getting high sniffing paint thinner that night. He'd been hallucinating when the car in which he was riding was pulled over for speeding. He had an outstanding warrant, he claimed, and felt sure that Deputy Constable Eakin was going to arrest him. So he ran into a field alongside the highway with the deputy in pursuit. When the young officer caught him, Lopez said he told Eakin that he'd rather die than go back to jail.
He was basically trying to justify his actions. He was sticking with his story that he had a pistol that he told Michael Aiken, and he had a pistol, and that he was going to kill himself if Aiken persisted in arresting him.
He told investigators he held a gun to his own head, and when Eakin tried to take the gun, they struggled. The gun went off, and Eakin went down. To assist in the case, Rosenthal called on one of Houston's best and most persuasive prosecutors, Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler. She began to research the case history of the defendant, Michael Lopez.
It was unbelievable that someone who was only 17, and he had just turned 17, had been in that much trouble with the law before and had gotten such light punishment so many times.
1 week after Deputy Constable Michael Eakin was buried, Michael Anthony Lopez was arraigned and charged with capital murder. Both Siegler and Rosenthal knew that they had a good case, but it wasn't airtight. There were no witnesses to the crime. There was no clear motive, and the murder weapon had never been recovered. The strength of the prosecutor's case was in the forensic evidence that had been gathered. Technicians found that Lopez had left fingerprints on the car in which he was riding before the murder took place. DNA evidence also placed him at the scene. Samples were gathered from the medallion found at the crime scene and the clothes the suspect left behind as he fled. The evidence was put through 3 levels of testing. First, tests were performed to determine the presence of biological fluid, such as blood. Then confirmatory tests were conducted to double-check the results. Finally, a comparison DNA analysis was completed. Harris County DNA analyst Robin Freeman conducted the lab work.
The DNA analysis in this case was used to confirm that the blood that was found at the crime scene was consistent with the blood of the suspect, Michael Lopez.
The prosecution believed the forensic evidence offered irrefutable proof that Lopez had indeed been in the field where the deputy's body was found. Ballistics tests also confirmed that the 2 bullets that killed Deputy Eakin were fired by the same gun, most likely a .38 caliber Rossi revolver. But the gun still had not been recovered. According to his friends, Lopez had been seen with a .38 caliber Rossi in the past. Lopez said he lost his gun when he hid out overnight in a dumpster located about a mile from the shooting. But when detectives and a forensic team went back to retrieve it, they discovered more bloodstains, but no gun. The dumpster had been emptied. The weapon would be impossible to find.
I walked right back to here.
Without a weapon or an eyewitness to link Lopez to the crime, the prosecutors were left with a case made up mainly of circumstantial evidence. But they did have Lopez's confession, both in written form and on videotape. It was, in fact, the cornerstone to their case. The defense, in coming weeks, would take direct aim at this key piece of evidence. If the defense could convince a judge to rule the confessions inadmissible, the door would be open for an acquittal. Michael Anthony Lopez was charged with the shooting death of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin in September 1998. By the spring of 1999, prosecutors Chuck Rosenthal and Kelly Siegler were still hard at work, sifting through evidence, planning courtroom strategy, and fighting off a wave of defense motions that, if successful, would have crippled their case. The defense alleged that Lopez had been beaten and coerced into making his confessions. They asked for a change in venue.
And to the jury,
they even requested the removal of prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal, claiming his conversations with the defendant might make it necessary for him to be called as a witness.
They didn't have legal grounds to do that because there are other witnesses who could testify to the same things I could.
In a victory for the prosecution, the judge denied all such defense motions. The prosecutors could now focus on how they would present their case to a jury. On May 17, 1999, the case of the state of Texas versus Michael Anthony Lopez came to trial. In her opening statement, Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler declared that the prosecution had a strong case. There were eyewitnesses who saw Deputy Constable Eakin chase Lopez into the field. DNA evidence connecting Lopez to the crime scene. And perhaps most damning of all, there was the videotaped confession in which Lopez admitted to killing Michael Eakin. Siegler and fellow prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal were confident they had enough evidence for a conviction. The defense opted not to make an opening statement, choosing instead to refute the prosecution's case piece by piece over the course of the trial. It's a strategy that can put even a seasoned prosecutor on edge. Without an opening statement from the defense, the prosecution can't even get a glimpse of what the defense strategy will be.
Come with me.
On the first day of the trial, 3 of the occupants of the Cadillac were called to the witness stand. Their descriptions of the night of the murder were consistent. The 6 teenagers had no specific plans that evening. They were, they testified, just hanging out.
There were no plans at all. Were there any kind of drugs in the back seat of the car?
Yes, sir.
What was that?
The witnesses admitted that on the night of the shooting, they had been huffing, a cheap method of getting high by inhaling paint thinner fumes. When the Cadillac was pulled over, Lopez became anxious. He was wanted on a probation violation, he told his friends. He then asked Ortiz to stop the car in a spot that would make it easier for him to run if he needed to. Deputy Eakin was polite and professional, the teenagers said.
Aracela Gonzalez.
He asked them for their identification. When Lopez produced none, the deputy told him to get out of the car. He was going to frisk the young man, but at the first opportunity, Lopez bolted, and the deputy gave chase into the darkness. Moments later, through the muggy stillness, came gunshots.
Was the only one asked to...
Through the testimony of the other teenagers in the car with Lopez on the night of the shooting, the prosecution established that the defendant was high, he was agitated, and he was the only one who ran off into the field that night.
Do you know the names of the other deputies that actually went
Prosecutors
inside
then introduced a parade of deputies who described the discovery of Deputy Eakin's body, the manhunt for Lopez, and the careful collection of forensic evidence. Deputy Sean Conrad proved to be one of the strongest witnesses for the prosecution.
On the night of Deputy Eakin's, who was the first to find his body?
Conrad, like many officers, had been called to the scene after Deputy Michael Eakin had stopped responding to radio calls.
Arrived to the scene of the crime, several deputies.
He hoped to find Eakin somewhere in the field, he said, hunting for his radio on the ground.
I was the first.
And how did you find his body?
But then he spotted the mortally wounded deputy.
Well, he was lying on his back, and he had what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his throat. And I was hoping he was still alive, but I knew he wasn't.
Thank you very much, officer.
With Deputy Conrad still on the stand, the defense took the opportunity to start whittling away at the credibility of the state's witnesses. Defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez argued that his client, Michael Lopez, had been beaten by police at the time of his arrest and later coerced into giving his confessions. It was a plausible assertion. The defendant was accused of killing their fellow law enforcement officer, and he had multiple cuts and bruises on his face when he was booked. Deputy Conrad was asked to testify about the night Lopez was apprehended.
And isn't it true, sir, that there were some people out there who were a little hot-headed?
What do you mean by hot-headed?
Deputy Conrad disagreed with the defense's claim that the arresting officers were bent on beating up Lopez. But defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez pointed out that Conrad was not actually present at the moment Michael Lopez was found in the abandoned garage. So Conrad couldn't have known whether or not the defendant had been beaten when he was arrested.
Officer, you personally didn't go inside that garage to effect the arrest of this defendant, did you, sir?
No, sir. He was already being brought out by the time I made it up to the garage.
Other deputies on the stand vigorously denied any wrongdoing, though the defense questioned why none of the officers who actually made the arrest had been called by the prosecution to testify.
Officer, isn't there a code of silence in the precinct not to talk about somebody getting beat up?
I've never been involved in anything that would be a beating.
But isn't it common knowledge, sir, that if one deputy sees another deputy beating a defendant, that deputy isn't going to say anything, is he?
Objection. That's sustained.
Is there or is there not a code of silence among police officers?
I can't answer for other police officers. I can only answer for myself.
You've heard of it, have you not, sir?
I've heard what some people have said about it. Yes, sir.
The defense probing forced one deputy to admit he'd noticed a fresh cut on the forehead of Lopez when he was taken into custody. And photos of the defendant taken in jail showed what looked like fresh bruises on his back and limbs, With each cross-examination, the defense looked stronger. But with only one day of testimony left, prosecutors Chuck Rosenthal and Kelly Siegler knew the most persuasive witness had yet to be heard. Michael Anthony Lopez was on trial for the murder of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. For 2 straight days, Lopez had been forced to listen to friends, police officers, and forensic experts all testify against him. Now, in an odd twist, the young defendant would hear perhaps the most damning witness of all speak against him. That witness was himself. Prosecutors played the videotaped confession that Lopez gave soon after his capture.
And then he pats you down.
Brought back to the grassy field where the murder took place, Lopez had detailed the whole crime, explaining why he ran and why he fired the fatal shots.
And then I run.
And you run where? Do you run this way? Do you run this way?
No, I ran that way.
He was still high, he said, when Eakin made him get out of the car. He'd started thinking about his life and how he didn't want to go to jail, to be away from his girlfriend, his family. He felt his only option was to run.
Over next to that building and then
In the struggle with Deputy Eakin, Lopez claimed, he pulled out his gun and held it to his own head, threatening to kill himself rather than go to jail. The deputy was behind him when he raised the gun up over his shoulder, pointing it blindly.
Okay. The gun goes off?
Yeah.
Then, Lopez claimed, his mind went blank. The confession was powerful, but it also offered a plausible argument for the defense. For Lopez consistently stated on the tape that the shooting had been an accident. To be convicted of capital murder, prosecutors would have to prove that Lopez killed the deputy intentionally or knowingly. There was no way prosecutors could get inside the defendant's mind. But they had one final piece of evidence they felt certain would convince the jury of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Deputy Eakin's body, as it was discovered in the grassy field that night, offered vital clues to crime scene investigators like John Dickinson. He took the stand to refute the defendant's version of events.
Well, according to Lopez, both he and the officer had their guns out and they were struggling, and Lopez's gun went off first. But if that were the case, Eakin would have been found on the ground with the gun in his hand or the gun on the ground.
Eakin's body was discovered gripping a pair of open handcuffs, and his gun was still in its holster. According to Dickinson, if the defendant had truly been flailing a gun about as he claimed, there was no way Eakin would have holstered his weapon and tried to handcuff an armed suspect. Post-mortem examinations of the body and testimony from the coroner also confirmed that the shots were fired at very close range. And the angle of bullet entry wounds indicated that at least one shot, the shot that severed Eakin's spinal cord, was likely fired when the deputy was lying on the ground.
We've heard about a video confession.
The trial lasted 4 days. Both sides gave impassioned closing statements. Defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez insisted the confession was coerced, claiming the defendant had been in no condition to make a coherent decision, having been beaten and having gone without sleep for more than 40 hours.
No matter what you do.
If the jury agreed, they would have no choice but to throw out the confession and base their verdict on the remaining circumstantial evidence. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler spoke with equal determination. It was easy to feel sorry for him, she said. Sitting there in a suit, the defendant seemed young, meek. But there was a violence and rage and impulsiveness that burned inside his soul, she added.
And he's going to do anything he can.
Then, an outburst by the defendant disrupted the courtroom.
No, that's not right.
Finally, Kelly Siegler thought, the jury caught a glimpse of the real Michael Lopez.
Listen to me.
And you know, the point was for the jury to see that temper he just can't control. Nobody can control it. Even in a courtroom when he's on trial for his very life with Ted Poe on the bench and police officers all over the place, he still can't control his temper.
After deliberating for a mere 2.5 hours, the jury sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The jury declared Michael Anthony Lopez guilty of the murder of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. Despite his impassioned pleas, Lopez would have to pay for his crime. But how? Life imprisonment or execution? The death penalty required a unanimous decision. All 12 jurors would have to be in agreement.
If any one person on the jury believes that there's any one reason or factor that makes them go, you know what, just because of that, just because I feel like it in my heart, I want to give him a life sentence, the law allows him to do it. It gives him an out.
Prosecutors had to convince the jury of 2 points: that Michael Lopez posed a future threat to society, and that there were no circumstances in his life that would warrant a life sentence instead of execution. The prosecution team presented a series of witnesses who had observed a gradual escalation of violent behavior. Others had been victimized. His girlfriend's sister testified that he had threatened her with a gun. She claimed that he'd told her of his wish to kill a police officer. The defense had a different strategy. In lieu of many voices, they chose one, a persuasive and sympathetic witness. That witness was Michael Anthony Lopez Sr., the defendant's father.
And how long have you been in jail?
Admittedly a terrible role model, the elder Lopez had been in jail more often than out of it. He expressed humility and regret at having failed to support his son in any way.
Didn't lead him at all.
And he begged the jury to be merciful. While the jury deliberated, Siegler's thoughts kept returning to the victim. Like Lopez, Deputy Michael Eakin also came from a broken home, growing up in the tough, lower-income neighborhoods of Houston, Texas.
I guess it's just there was something in Michael Eakin inside him that made him turn out to be good and different and want to be a cop.
After nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with its verdict in the sentencing phase of the trial. Again, it was unanimous. He received the death penalty. State District Judge Ted Poe spoke directly to the defendant before adjourning.
I wanted to make sure he knew what he had done, that he was personally accountable for his actions. It wasn't society's fault. It wasn't his neighborhood's fault. He chose to murder a police officer.
Michael Lopez is currently on death row in Texas, awaiting the same fate to which he sentenced his victim. Michael Eakin is still fondly remembered by family, friends, and the prosecutors who worked to bring his killer to justice.